To Mr. Jardice, Joe repeats in substance what he said in the morning, without any material variation, only that cart of his is heavier to draw and draws with a hollower sound. Let me lay here quiet, and not be chivied no more, falters Joe, and be so kind any person, as is a passing night where I usefully sleep, as just to say to Mr. Sainsbury that Joe what he known wants is a moving on right forwards with his duty, and I'll be very thankful. I'd be more thankful than I am already if it was anyways possible for an unfortunate to be it. He makes so many of these references to the law stationer in the course of a day or two, but Alan, after conferring with Mr. Jardice, good-naturedly resolves to call in Cook's Court the rather as the cart seems to be breaking down to Cook's Court. Therefore he repairs. Mr. Snagsby is behind his counter in his grey coat and sleeves, inspecting an indenture of several skins, which has just come in from the engrosser's, an immense desert of law, hand and parchment with here and their resting place of a few large letters, to break the awful monotony and save the traveler from despair. Mr. Snagsby puts up at one of these inky wells and greets the stranger with his cough of general preparation. For business, you don't remember me, Mr. Snagsby. The stationer's heart begins to thump heavily, for his old apprehensions have never abated. It is as much as he can do to answer, no sir, I can't say I do. I should have considered not to put too fine a point upon it, that I never saw you before, sir. Twice before, says Alan Woodcourt, once at a poor bedside, and once it's come at last, thinks the afflicted stationer, as recollection breaks upon him. It's got to a head now, and it's going to burst, but he has sufficient presence of mind to conduct his visitor into the little counting house, and to shut the door. Are you a married man, sir? No, I am not. Would you make the attempt, though? Single, says Mr. Snagsby in a melancholy whisper. To speak as low as you can, for my little woman is a listening somewheres, or I'll forfeit the business and £500. In deep dejection, Mr. Snagsby sits down on his stool with his back against his desk, protesting. I never had a secret of my own, sir. I can't charge my memory with ever having once attempted to deceive my little woman on my own account. Since she named the day, I wouldn't have done it, sir. Not to put too fine a point upon it, I couldn't have done it. I durstn't have done it. Whereas, and nevertheless, I find myself wrapped round with secrecy and mystery till my life is a burden to me. His visitor professes his regret to hear it, and asks him does he remember Joe. Mr. Snagsby answers with a suppressed groan, oh, don't he? You couldn't name an individual human being except myself that my little woman is more set and determined against than Joe, says Mr. Snagsby. Alan asks why repeats Mr. Snagsby in his desperation, clutching at the clump of hair at the back of his bald head. How should I know why? But you are a single person, sir, and may you long be spared to ask a married person such a question. With this beneficent wish, Mr. Snagsby coughs a cough of dismal resignation and submits himself to hear what the visitor has to communicate. There again, says Mr. Snagsby, who between the earnestness of his feelings and the suppressed tones of his voice is discolored in the face at it again in a new direction. A certain person charges me in the solemnest way not to talk of Joe to anyone, even my little woman. Then comes another certain person in a person of yourself, and charges me in an equally solemn way not to mention Joe to that other certain person above all other persons. Why, this is a private asylum. Why not to put too fine a point upon it? This is bedlam, sir, says Mr. Snagsby. But it is better than he expected, after all, being no explosion of the mine below him or deepening of the pit into which he has fallen, and being tender-hearted and affected by the account he hears of Joe's condition, he readily engages to look round as early in the evening as he can manage it quietly. He looks round very quietly when the evening comes. But it may turn out that Mrs. Snagsby is as quiet a manager as he. Joe is very glad to see his old friend, and says when they are left alone that he takes it uncommon kind, as Mr. Sangsby should come so far out of his way on accounts of such as him. Mr. Sangsby, touched by the spectacle before him, immediately lays upon the table half a crown, that magic balsam of his for all kinds of wounds. And how do you find yourself, my poor lad? Inquires the stationer with his cough of sympathy. I am in luck, Mr. Sainsbury, I am, returns Joe, and don't want for nothing. I'm more comfire nor you can't think, Mr. Sainsbury. I'm very sorry that I done it, but I didn't go for to do it, sir. The stationer softly lays down another half-crown and asks him what it is that he is sorry for having done. Mr. Sangsby says, Joe, I went and give a illness to the lady as was, and yet as what the taller lady, and none of 'em never says nothing to me for having done it on accounts of their being so good. Am I having been some fortunate? The lady come herself and see me yesterday, and she says, "Oh Joe," she says, "we thought we lost you, Joe," she says, and she sits down and smiling so quiet I don't pass a word nor yet a look upon me for having done it. She don't when I turns again a wall I do's Mr. Sangsby. And Mr. Jarndyce, I see him a forced to turn away his own self, and Mr. Woodcott he come for to give me something for to ease me what these haulers are doing on day and night. And when he come bending over me and speaking up so bold I see his tears are falling. Mr. Sangsbury, the softened stationer, deposits another half-crown on the table. Nothing less than a repetition of that infallible remedy will relieve his feelings. What I was a-thinking on, Mr. Sangsbury proceeds, Joe, was as you was able to write very large. Perhaps yes, Joe, please God, returns the stationer, uncommon precious large. Perhaps, says Joe with eagerness. Yes, my poor boy. Joe laughs with pleasure. Oh, what I was have thinking on then, Mr. Sangsby, was that when I was moved on as far as ever I could go and couldn't be moved no further, wherever you might miss a good purpose, as to write out very large, so that anyone could see it anywheres, as I was very truly awfully sorry I done it, and I never went for to do it. And although I didn't know nothing at all, I noticed Mr. Woodcock once cried over it, and was on a screeve over it, and that I hoped as he'd be able to forgive me in his mind if the writing could be made to say it very large. He might it shall say it, Joe, very large. Joe laughs again. Oh, thank you, Mr. Sainsbury. Oh, it's very kind of you, sir, and it makes me more comfortable than all I was before. The meek little stationer with a broken and unfinished cough slips down his fourth half-crown. He has never been so close to a case requiring so many, and is fain to depart. And Joe and he upon this little earth shall meet no more, for the cart so hard to draw is near its journey's end, and drags over stony ground all round the clock. It labors up the broken steps shattered and worn not many times can the sun rise, and behold it still upon its weary road. Phil Squad, with his smoky gunpowder visage, at once acts as nurse and works as armorer at his little table in a corner, often looking round and saying with a nod of his green baize cap and an encouraging elevation of his one eyebrow, "Hold up, my boy, hold up there too is Mr. John Dacey." Many a time, and Alan Woodcourt almost always, both thinking much how strangely fate has entangled this rough outcast in the web of very different lives. There to the trooper is a frequent visitor, filling the doorway with his athletic figure, and from his superfluity of life and strength seeming to shed down temporary vigor upon Joe, who never fails to speak more robustly in answer to his cheerful words. Joe is in a sleep or in a stupor today, and Alan Woodcourt, newly arrived, stands by him, looking down upon his wasted form. After a while he softly seats himself upon the bedside with his face towards him, just as he sat in the law writer's room, and touches his chest and heart. The cart had very nearly given up, but labors on a little more. The trooper stands in the doorway still and silent. Phil has stopped. In a low clinking noise, with his little hammer in his hand, Mr. Woodcourt looks round with that grave professional interest and attention on his face, and glancing significantly at the trooper, signs to Phil to carry his table out. When the little hammer is next used, there will be a speck of rust upon it. "Well, Joe, what is the matter? Don't be frightened, I thought," says Joe, who has started and is looking round. "I thought I was in Tom all alone again. Ain't there nobody here but you, Mr. Woodcock?" "Nobody, and I ain't took back to Tom all alone's, am I, sir?" "No." Joe closes his eyes, muttering, "Oh, I'm very thankful." After watching him closely a little while, Alan puts his mouth very near his ear and says to him in a low, distinct voice, "Joe, did you ever know a prayer?" "Never." "No, nothing, sir, not so much as one short prayer?" "No, sir, nothing at all." Mr. Chad Bands, he was a praying monster, Mr. Sang's piece, and I heard him, but he sounded as if he was speaking to himself and not to me. He prayed a lot, but I couldn't make out nothing on it. Different times there was other gentlemen come down Tom all alone to pray, but they almostly said as the tougher ones prayed wrong, and almostly sounded to be a talking to theirselves, or a passing blame on the tubbers, and not a talking to us. We never knowed nothing. I never knowed what it was all about. It takes him a long time to say this, and few but an experienced and attentive listener could hear or hearing understand him. After a short relapse into sleep or stupor, he makes of a sudden a strong effort to get out of bed. "Stay, Joe, what now? It's time for me to go to that there burying ground, sir," he returns with a wild look lie down, and tell me what burying ground Joe wherever. I laid him as was where he good to me, indeed he was. It's time for me to go down about their burying ground, sir, and ask to be put along with him. I want us to go there and be buried. He used to say to me, I am as poor as you. Today Joe, he says, I want us to tell him that I am as poor as him now, and have come there to be laid along with him by Joe, oh perhaps I wouldn't do it if I was to go myself, but will you promise to have me took there, sir, and laid along with him? I will indeed. Thank you, sir. They'll have to get the key of the gate before they can take me in, for it's always locked, and there's a stick there as I use for to clean with my broom. Mr. Very Dark, sir, is there any light her coming? It is coming fast, Joe, fast. The cart is shaken all to pieces, and the rugged road is very near its end. Joe, my poor fellow, I hear you sigh in the dark, but I'm a groping. Let me catch hold of your hand. Joe, can you say what I say? Oh, say anything as you say, sir. But I know it's good. Our Father, oh yeah, that's very good, sir, which art in heaven, is the light a coming, sir, it is close at hand, hallowed be thy name, all hold we lie, the light is come upon the dark benighted way, dead your majesty, dead my lords and gentlemen, dead right reverence and wrong reverence of every order, dead men and women born with heavenly compassion in your hearts, and dying thus around us every day. Chapter 48. Closing in the place in Lincolnshire has shut its many eyes again, and the house in town is awake in Lincolnshire. The deadlocks of the past doze in their picture frames, and the low wind murmurs through the long drawing room as if they were breathing pretty regularly in town. The deadlocks of the present rattle in their fire-eyed carriages through the darkness of the night, and the deadlock Mercuries with ashes or hair powder on their heads, symptomatic of their great humility, loll away. The drowsy mornings in the little windows of the hall. The fashionable world, tremendous orb nearly 5 miles round, is in full swing, and the solar system works respectfully at its appointed distances, where the throng is thickest, where the lights are brightest, where all the senses are ministered to with the greatest delicacy and refinement. Lady Dedlock is from the shining heights she has scaled and taken. She is never absent, though the belief she of old reposed in herself as one able to reserve whatsoever she would under her mantle of pride is beaten down, though she has no assurance that what she is to those around her she will remain another day. It is not in her nature, when envious eyes are looking on, to yield or to droop. They say of her that she has lately grown more handsome and more haughty. The debilitated cousin says of her that she's beauty enough to set up a shop of women, but rather alarming kind, reminding man, in fact an inconvenient woman who will get out of bed and ball the establishment. Shakespeare. Mr. Tulkinghorn says nothing looks nothing now as heretofore. He is to be found in doorways of rooms, with his limp white cravat loosely twisted into its old-fashioned tie, receiving patronage from the peerage and making no sign of all men. He is still the last who might be supposed to have any influence upon my lady of all women. She is still the last who might be supposed to have any dread of him. One thing has been much on her mind since their late interview in his turreted room at Chesney Wold. She is now decided and prepared to throw it off at his morning in the great world. Afternoon. According to the little sun, the Mercuries, exhausted by looking out of window, are reposing in the hall and hang their heavy heads. The gorgeous creatures, like overblown sunflowers, like them too, they seem to run to a deal of seed in their tags and trimmings. Celeste in the library has fallen asleep for the good of the country over the report of a parliamentary committee. My lady sits in the room in which she gave audience to the young man of the name of Guppy. Rosa is with her and has been writing for her and reading to her. Rosa is now at work upon embroidery or some such pretty thing, and as she bends her head over it, my lady watches her in silence. Not for the first time today, Rosa, the pretty village face, looks brightly up, then seeing how serious my lady is, looks puzzled and surprised. See to the door. Is it shut? Yes. She goes to it and returns and looks yet more surprised. I am about to place confidence in you, child, for I know I may trust your attachment, if not your judgment, in what I'm going to do. I will not disguise myself to you, at least, but I confide in you. Say nothing to anyone of what passes between us. The timid little beauty promises in all earnestness to be trustworthy. Do you know, Lady Dedlock asks her, signing to her to bring her chair nearer, do you know, Rosa, that I am different to you from what I am to anyone? Yes, my lady, much kinder But then I often think I know you as you really are. You often think you know me as I really am. Poor child, she says it with a kind of scorn, though not of Rosa, and sits brooding, looking dreamily at her. Do you think, Rosa, you are any relief or comfort to me? Do you suppose your being young and natural and fond of me and grateful to me makes it any pleasure to me to have you near me? I don't know, my lady, I can scarcely hope so, but with all my heart I wish it was so. It is so, little one. The pretty face is checked in its flush of pleasure by the dark expression on the handsome face. Before it looks timidly for an explanation. And if I were to say today, go leave me, I should say what would give me great pain and disquiet, child, and what would leave me very solitary. My lady, have I offended you in nothing? Come here. Rosa bends down on the footstool at my lady's feet. My lady, with that motherly touch of the famous Iron Master Knight, lays her hand upon her dark hair and gently keeps it there. I told you, Rosa, that I wished you to be happy, that I would make you so. If I could make anybody happy on this earth, I cannot. There are reasons now known to me, reasons in which you have no part, rendering it far better for you that you should not remain here. You must not remain here. I have determined that you shall not. I have written to the father of your lover, and he will be here today. All this I have done for your sake. The weeping girl covers her hand with kisses and says, what shall she do? What shall she do when they are separated? A mistress kisses her on the cheek and makes no other answer. Now be happy, child, under better circumstances. Be beloved and happy. Oh, my lady, I have sometimes thought, forgive my being so free, that you are not happy. I will you be more so when you have sent me away. Pray think again. Let me stay a little while. I have said, my child, that what I do for your sake, not my own. It is done. What I am towards you, Rosa, is what I am now, not what I shall be a little while hence. Remember this and keep my confidence. Do so much for my sake. And thus all ends between us. She detaches herself from her simple-hearted companion and leaves the room. Late in the afternoon, when she next appears upon the staircase, she is in her hottest and coldest state, as indifferent as if all passion, feeling, and interest had been worn out in the earlier ages of the world and had perished from its surface. With its other departed monsters, Mercury has announced Mr. Ranswell, which is the cause of her appearance. Mr. Ranswell is not in the library, but she repairs to the library. Celeste is there, and she wishes to speak to him first. Celeste, I am desirous, but you are engaged. Oh dear, no, not at all. Only Mr. Tulkinghorn, always at hand, haunting every place. No relief or security from him for a moment. I beg your pardon, Lady Dedlock, will you allow me to retire? With a look that plainly says, you know, you have the power to remain if you will. She tells him it is not necessary and moves towards a chair. Mr. Tulkinghorn brings it a little forward for her with his clumsy bow and retires into a window opposite, interposed between her and the fading light of day. In the now quiet street his shadow falls upon her, and he darkens all before her. Even so does he darken her life. It is a dull street under the best conditions, where the two long rows of houses stare at each other with that severity that half a dozen of its greatest mansions seem to have been slowly stared into stone, rather than originally built in that material. It is a street of such dismal grandeur, so determined not to condescend to liveliness, for the doors and windows hold a gloomy state of their own in black paint and dust, and the echoing mews behind have a dry and massive appearance, as if they were reserved to stable the stone chargers of noble statues. Complicated garnish of ironwork entwined itself over the flights of steps in this awful street, and from these petrified bowers extinguishers for obsolete flambeaux gasp at the upstart gas here, and there a weak little iron hoop through which bold boys aspire to throw their friends' caps. Its only present use retains its place among the rusty foliage sacred to the memory of departed oil, nay, even oil itself, yet lingering at long intervals in a little absurd glass pot with a knob in the bottom, like an oyster, blinks and sulks at newer lights every night, like its high and dry master in the House of Lords. Therefore there is not much that Lady Dedlock, seated in her chair, could wish to see through the window in which Mr. Tulkinghorn stands, and yet she sends a look in that direction as if it were her heart's desire to have that figure moved out of the way. Celeste begs his lady's pardon. She was about to say only that Mr. Rouncil is here. He is called by my appointment, and that we had better make an end of the question of that girl. I am tired to death of the matter. What can I do to assist? Demands Sir Leicester in some considerable doubt. Let us see him here and have done with it. Will you tell them to send him up? Mr. Tulkinghorn be so good as to ring. Thank you request, says Sir Leicester to Mercury, not immediately remembering the business term request. The Iron Gentleman. To walk this way, Mercury departs in search of the Iron Gentleman, finds and produces him. Celeste receives that ferocious person graciously. I hope you are well, Mr. Rouncil. Be seated at my solicitor, Mr. Tulkinghorn. My lady was desirous. Mr. Ranswell. Celeste skillfully transfers him. With a solemn wave of his hand, was desirous to speak with you. I shall be very happy, returns the Iron Gentleman, to give my best attention to anything Lady Dedlock does me the honor to say. As he turns towards her, he finds that the impression she makes upon him is less agreeable than on the former occasion. A distant, supercilious air makes a cold atmosphere about her, and there is nothing in her bearing as there was before to encourage openness. Pray, sir, says Lady Dedlock listlessly, may I be allowed to inquire whether anything has passed between you and your son respecting your son's fancy? It is almost too troublesome to her languid eyes to bestow a look upon him as she asks this question. If my memory serves me, Lady Dedlock, I said, when I had the pleasure of seeing you before, that I should seriously advise my son to conquer that fancy. The Iron Master repeats her expression with a little emphasis. And did you? Oh, of course I did. Celeste gives a nod, approving and confirmatory. Very proper. The Iron Gentleman, having said that he would do it, was bound to do it. No difference in this respect between the base metals and the precious. Highly proper. And pray, has he done so really? Lady Dedlock, I cannot make you a definite reply. I fear not. Probably not yet. In our condition of life we sometimes couple an intention with our fancies, which renders them not altogether easy to throw off. I think it is rather our way to be in earnest. Celeste has a misgiving that there may be a hidden, what Tylerish meaning in this expression, and fums a little. Mr. Ransom is perfectly good-humored and polite, but within such limits evidently adapts his tone to his reception, because, proceeds my lady, I have been thinking of the subject, which is tiresome to me. I am very sorry, I'm sure, and also of what Celeste said upon it, in which I quite concur. Celeste flattered, and if you cannot give us the assurance that this fancy is at an end, I have come to the conclusion that the girl had better leave me. I can give no such assurance, Lady Dedlock, nothing of the kind. Then she had better go. Excuse me, my lady, Sir Leicester considerately interposes, but perhaps this may be doing an injury to the young woman, which she has not merited. Here is a young woman, Sir Leicester, magnificently laying out the matter with his right hand, like a service of plate, whose good fortune it is to have attracted the notice and favor of an eminent lady, and to live under the protection of that eminent lady, surrounded by the various advantages which such a position confers, and which are unquestionably very great. I believe unquestionably very great, sir, for a young woman in that station of life. The question then arises, should that young woman be deprived of these many advantages and that good fortune simply because she has? Sir Leicester, with an apologetic but dignified inclination of his head towards the Iron Master, winds up his sentence. It has attracted the notice of Mr. Rouncil's son. Now has she deserved this punishment? Is this just towards her? Is this our previous understanding? I beg your pardon, interposes Mr. Ransom's son's father. Sir Leicester, will you allow me? I think I may shorten the subject. Pray dismiss that from your consideration. If you remember anything so unimportant which is not to be expected, you would recollect that my first thought in the affair was directly opposed to her remaining here. Dismiss the Dedlock patronage from consideration. Oh, Sir Leicester is bound to believe a pair of ears that have been handed down to him through such a family, or he really might have mistrusted their report of the Iron Gentleman's observations. It is not necessary, observes my lady in her coldest manner, before he can do anything but breathe amazingly, to enter into these matters on either side. The girl is a very good girl. I have nothing whatever to say against her, but she is so far insensible to her many advantages and her good fortune that she is in love, or supposes she is, poor little fool, and unable to appreciate them. Sir Leicester begs to observe that wholly alters the case. He might have been sure that my lady had the best grounds and reasons in support of her view. He entirely agrees with my lady. The young woman had better go, as Sir Leicester observed Mr. Ranswell on the last occasion, when we were fatigued by this business. Lady Dedlock languidly proceeds, we cannot make conditions with you without conditions, and under present circumstances the girl is quite misplaced here, and had better go. I have told her so. Would you wish to have her sent back to the village, Or would you like to take her with you, or what would you prefer, Lady Deadlock? If I may speak plainly, by all means I should prefer the course which will the soonest relieve you of the encumbrance and remove her from her present position. And to speak as plainly, she returns with the same studied carelessness, though should I understand that you will take her with you. The iron gentleman makes an iron bow. Celeste, will you ring? Mr. Tulkinghorn steps forward from his window and pulls the bell. I had forgotten you. Thank you. He makes his usual bow and goes quietly back again. Mercury, swift, responsive, appears, receives instructions. Whom to produce, skims away, produces the aforesaid, and departs. Rosa has been crying and is yet in distress on her coming in. The Iron Master leaves his chair, takes her arm in his, and remains with her near the door, ready to depart. You are taken charge of, you see, says my lady in her weary manner, and are going away well protected. I have mentioned that you are a very good girl, and you have nothing to cry for. She seems, after all, observes Mr. Tulkinghorn, loitering a little forward, with his hands behind him, as if she were crying and going away. Why, she is not well bred, you see, returns Mr. Ransell with some quickness in his manner, as if he were glad to have the lawyer to retort upon. And she's an inexperienced little thing, and knows no better. If she had remained here, sir, she would have improved, no doubt, no doubt. As Mr. Tulkinghorn's composed reply, Rosa sobs out that she is very sorry to leave my lady, and that she was happy at Chesney Wold, and has been happy with my lady, and that she thanks my lady over and over again. Out, you silly little puss, says the Iron Master, checking her in a low voice, though not angrily. Have a spirit if you're fond of what my lady merely waves her off with indifference, saying, there, child, you are a good girl, go away. Celeste has magnificently disengaged himself from the subject and retired into the sanctuary of his blue coat. Mr. Tulkinghorn, an indistinct form against the dark street now dotted with lamps, looms in my lady's view bigger and blacker than before. Celeste and Lady Deadlock, says Mr. Rouncil. After a pause of a few moments, I beg to take my leave with an apology for having again troubled you, though not of my own act, on this tiresome subject. I can very well understand, I assure you, how tiresome so small a matter must have become to Lady Deadlock. If I am doubtful of my dealing with it, it is only because I did not at first quietly exert my influence to take my young friend here away without troubling you at all. But it appeared to me, I dare say, magnifying the importance of the thing, that it was respectful to explain to you how the matter stood, and candid to consult your wishes and convenience. I hope you will excuse my want of acquaintance with the polite world. Celeste considers himself evoked out of the sanctuary by these remarks. Mr. Rodswell, he returns, do not mention it. Justifications are unnecessary, I hope, on either side. I am glad to hear it, Celeste. And if I may, by way of a last word, revert to what I said before of my mother's long connection with the family, and the worth it bespeaks on both sides, I would point out this little instance here on my arm, who shows herself so affectionate and faithful in parting, and in whom my mother, I dare say, has done something to awaken such feelings, though of course Lady Deadlock, by her heartfelt interest and her genial condescension, has done much more. If he mean this ironically, it may be truer than he thinks. He points it, however, by no deviation from his straightforward manner of speech, though in saying it he turns towards that part of the dim room where my lady sits. Celeste stands to return his parting salutation. Mr. Tulkinghorn again rings. Mercury takes another flight, and Mr. Ransom and Rosa leave the house. Then lights are brought in, discovering Mr. Tulkinghorn still standing in his window with his hands behind him, and my lady still sitting with his figure before her, closing up her view of the night as well as of the day. She is very pale. Mr. Tulkinghorn, observing it as she rises to retire, thinks, well, she may be, the power of this woman is astonishing. She has been acting a part the whole time, but he can act a part too, is one unchanging character, and as he holds the door open for this woman, 50 pairs of eyes, each 50 times sharper than Celeste's pair, should find no flaw in him. Lady Deadlock dines alone in her own room. Today Celeste is whipped into the rescue of the Doodle party and the discomfiture of the Coodle faction. Lady Deadlock asks, on sitting down to dinner, still deadly pale and quite an illustration of the debilitated cousin's text, whether he is gone out. Yes, whether Mr. Tulkinghorn is gone. Yet no. Presently she asks again, is he gone yet? No. What is he doing? Mercury thinks he is writing letters in the library. Would my lady wish to see him? Anything but that. But he wishes to see my lady within a few more minutes. He is reported as sending his respects and could my lady please to receive him for a word or two. After her dinner my lady will receive him. Now he comes, now apologizing for intruding even by her permission. While she is at table when they are alone, my lady waves her hand to dispense with such mockeries. What do you want, sir? Why, Lady Dedlock, says the lawyer, taking a chair at a little distance from her and slowly rubbing his rusty legs up and down, up and down, up and down. I am rather surprised by the course you have taken indeed. Yes, decidedly. I was not prepared for it. I consider it a departure from our agreement and your promise. It puts us in a new position. Lady Dedlock, I feel myself under the necessity of saying that I don't approve of it. He stops in his rubbing and looks at her with his hands on his knees. Imputable and unchangeable as he is, there is still an indefinable freedom in his manner which is new and which does not escape this woman's observation. I do not quite understand you. Oh yes, you do. I think you do. Come, Lady Dedlock, we must not fence and parry now. You know you like this girl well, sir, and you know, and I know that you have not sent her away for the reasons you have assigned, but for the purpose of separating her as much as possible from excuse my mentioning it as a matter of business, any reproach and exposure that impend over yourself. Well, sir, well, Lady Dedlock, returns the lawyer, crossing his legs and nursing the uppermost knee. I object to that. I consider that a dangerous proceeding. I know it to be unnecessary and calculated to awaken speculation, doubt, rumor. I don't know what in the house. Besides, it is a violation of our agreement. You were to be exactly what you were before, whereas it must be evident to yourself, as it is to me, that you have been this evening very different from what you were before. Why, bless my soul, Lady Dedlock, transparently. So if sir, she begins in my knowledge of my secret, but he interrupts her. Now, Lady Dedlock, this is a matter of business, and in a matter of business the ground cannot be kept to clear. It is no longer your secret. Excuse me, that is just the mistake. It is my secret in trust for Sir Lester and the family. If it were your secret, Lady Dedlock, we should not be here holding this conversation. That is very true. If in my knowledge of the secret I do what I can to spare an innocent girl, especially remembering your own reference to her when you told my story to the assembled guests at Chesney Wold from the taint of my impending shame, I act upon a resolution. I have taken nothing in the world, and no one in the world could shake it or could move me. This she says with great deliberation and distinctness, and with no more outward passion than himself. As for him, he methodically discusses his matter of business as if she were any insensible instrument used in business. Really, that you see, Lady Dedlock, he returns, you are not to be trusted. You have put the case in a perfectly plain way and according to the literal fact, and that being the case, you are not to be trusted. Perhaps you may remember that I expressed some anxiety on this same point when we spoke at night at Chesney Wold. Yes, says Mr. Tulkinghorn, coolly getting up and standing on the hearth. Yes, I recollect, Lady Dedlock, that you certainly referred to the girl, but that was before we came to our arrangement, and both the letter and the spirit of our arrangement altogether precluded any action on your part founded upon my discovery. There can be no doubt about that. As to sparing the girl, of what importance or value is she? Spare Lady Dedlock here is a family name compromised. One might have supposed that the course was straight on over everything, neither to the right nor to the left, regardless of all considerations in the way, sparing nothing, trading everything underfoot. She has been looking at the table. She lifts up her eyes and looks at him. There is a stern expression on her face, and a part of her lower lip is compressed under her teeth. This woman understands me, Mr. Tulkinghorn thinks, as she lets her glance fall again. She cannot be spared. Why should she spare others? For a little while they are silent. Lady Dedlock has eaten no dinner, but has twice or thrice poured out water with a steady hand and drunk it. She rises from table, takes a lounging chair, and reclines in it, shading her face. There is nothing in her manner to express weakness or excite compassion. It is thoughtful, gloomy, concentrated. This woman thinks Mr. Tulkinghorn, standing on the hearth again, a dark object closing up her view, is a study. He studies her at his leisure, not speaking for a time. She too studies something at her leisure. She is not the first to speak, appearing indeed so unlikely to be so, though he stood there until midnight, that even he is driven upon breaking silence. Lady Dedlock, the most disagreeable part of this business interview remains, But it is business, our agreement is broken. A lady of your sense and strength of character will be prepared for my now declaring it void, and taking my own course. I am quite prepared. Mr. Tulkinghorn inclines his head. That is all I have to trouble you with, Lady Dedlock. She stops him as he is moving out of the room by asking, "This is the notice I was to receive. I wish not to misapprehend you." Not exactly the notice you were to receive, Lady Dedlock, because the contemplated notice supposed the agreement to have been observed, but virtually the same. The difference is merely in a lawyer's mind. You intend to give me no other notice. You are right. No, do you contemplate undeceiving Sir Leicester tonight? A home question, says Mr. Tulkinghorn with a slight smile, and cautiously shaking his head at the shaded face. No, not tonight. Tomorrow. All things considered, I had better decline answering that question, Lady Dedlock. If I were to say I don't know when exactly, you would not believe me, and it would answer no purpose. It may be tomorrow. I would rather say no more. You are prepared, and I hold out no expectations which circumstances might fail to justify. I wish you good evening. She removes her hand, turns her pale face towards him as he walks silently to the door and stops him once again as he is about to open it. Do you intend to remain in the house any time? I heard you were writing in the library. Are you going to return there? Only for my hat. I am going home. She bows her eyes rather than her head. The movement is so slight and curious, and he withdraws clear of the room. He looks at his watch, but is inclined to doubt it by a minute or thereabouts. There is a splendid clock upon the staircase, famous as splendid clocks not often are for its accuracy. And what do you say? Mr. Tulkinghorn inquires, referring to it. What do you say if it said, "Now don't go home"? Would a famous clock hereafter, if it said tonight of all the nights that it has counted off to this old man, of all the young and old men who have ever stood before it, don't go home with its sharp clear bell. It strikes 3/4 after 7 and ticks on again. Why, you are worse than I thought you, says Mr. Tulkinghorn, muttering reproof to his watch. 2 minutes wrong at this rate. You won't last my time. Would a watch to return good for evil? If it ticked in answer, don't go home. He passes out into the streets and walks on with his hands behind him under the shadow of the lofty houses, many of whose mysteries, difficulties, mortgaged, delicate affairs of all kinds are treasured up within his old black satin waistcoat. He is in the confidence of the very bricks and mortar. The high chimney stacks telegraph family secrets to him, yet there is not a voice in a mile of than to whisper, "Don't go home," through the stir and motion of the commonest streets, through the roar and jar of many vehicles, many feet, many voices, with the blazing shop lights lighting him on, the west wind blowing him on, and the crowd pressing him on. He is pitilessly urged upon his way, and nothing meets him, murmuring, "Don't go home." Arrived at last in his dull room to light his candles and look round and up and see the romang pointing from the ceiling. There is no new significance in the romang's hand tonight, or in the flutter of the attendant groups to give him the late warning, "Don't come here." It is a moonlight night, but the moon, being past the full, is only now rising over the great wilderness of London. The stars are shining as they shine above the turret ledges at Chesney Wold. This woman, as he has of late been so accustomed to call her, looks out upon them. Her soul is turbulent within her. She is sick at heart and restless. The large rooms are too cramped and close. She cannot endure their restraint, and will walk alone in a neighboring garden, too capricious and imperious in all she does to be the cause of much surprise in those about her as to anything she does. This woman, loosely muffled, goes out into the moonlight. Mercury attends with the key. Having opened the garden gate, he delivers the key into his lady's hands at her request, and is bidden to go back. She will walk there some time to ease her aching head. She may be an hour, she may be more. She needs no further escort. The gate shuts upon its spring with a clash, and he leaves her, passing on into the dark shade of some trees. A fine night, and a bright large moon, and multitudes of stars. Mr. Tulkinghorn, in repairing to his cellar, and in opening and shutting those resounding doors, has to cross a little prison-like yard. He looks up casually, thinking, what a fine night, what a bright large moon, what multitudes of stars. A quiet night, to a very quiet night, when the moon shines very brilliantly. Her solitude and stillness seem to proceed from her, that influence even crowded places full of life. Not only is it a still night on dusty high roads and on hill summits, whence a wide expanse of country may be seen in repose quieter, and quieter as it spreads away into a fringe of trees against the sky with the gray ghost of a bloom upon them. Not only is it a still night in gardens and in woods and on the river where the water meadows are fresh and green, and the stream sparkles on among pleasant islands, murmuring weirs and whispering rushes. Not only does the stillness attend it, as it flows where houses cluster thick, where many bridges are reflected in it, where walls and shipping make it black and awful, where it winds from these disfigured through marshes, whose grim beacons stand like skeletons washed ashore, where it expands through the boulder region of rising grounds rich in cornfield, windmill, and steeple, and where it mingles with the ever-heaving sea. Not only is it a still night on the deep and on the shore, where the watcher stands to see the ship with her spread wings cross the path of light that appears to be presented to only him, but even on this stranger's wilderness of London there is some rest. Its steeples and towers and its one great dome grow more ethereal, its smoky housetops lose their grossness in the pale effulgence. The noises that arise from the streets are fewer and are softened, and the footsteps on the pavements pass more tranquilly away in these fields of Mr. Tulkinghorn's inhabiting, where the shepherds play on chancery pipes that have no stop and keep their sheep in the fold by hook and by crook until they have shorn them exceeding close. Every noise is merged this moonlight night into a distant ringing hum, as if the city were a vast glass vibrating. What's that? Who fired a gun or pistol? Where was it? The few foot passengers start, stop, and stare about them. Some windows and doors are open, and people come out to look. It was a loud report, and echoed and rattled heavily. It shook one house, or so a man says, who was passing it. Has aroused all the dogs in the neighborhood, who bark vehemently. Terrified cats scamper across the road while the dogs are yet barking and howling. There is one dog howling like a demon. The church clocks, as if they were startled to begin to strike. The hum from the streets likewise seems to swell into a shout, but it is soon over before the last clock begins to strike 10. There is a lull when it has ceased. The fine night, the bright large moon, and multitudes of stars are left at peace again. Has Mr. Tulkinghorn been disturbed? His windows are dark and quiet, and his door is shut. It must be something unusual indeed to bring him out of his shell. Nothing is heard of him, nothing is seen of him. What power of cannon might it take to shake that rusty old man out of his immovable composure? For many years the persistent Romang has been pointing with no particular meaning from that ceiling. It is not likely that he has any new meaning in him tonight. Once pointing, always pointing, like any Romang, or even Briton with a single idea, there he is, no doubt, in his impossible attitude, pointing unavailingly. All night long, moonlight, darkness, dawn, sunrise, day, there he is still eagerly pointing, and no one minds him. But a little after the coming of the day come people to clean the rooms, and either the Romang has some new meaning in him not expressed before, or the foremost of them goes wild, for looking up at his outstretched hand and looking down at what is below it, that person shrieks and flies. The others looking in as the first one looked shriek and fly too, and there is an alarm in the street. What does it mean? No light is admitted into the darkened chamber, and people unaccustomed to it enter, and treading softly but heavily carry a weight into the bedroom and lay it down. There is whispering and wondering all day, strict search of every corner, careful tracing of steps, and careful noting of the disposition of every article of furniture. All eyes look up at the Romang, and all voices murmur, if he could only tell what he saw. He is pointing at a table with a bottle nearly full of wine and a glass upon it, and to candles that were blown out suddenly soon after being lighted. He is pointing at an empty chair and at a stain upon the ground before it that might be almost covered with a hand. These objects lie directly within his range. An excited imagination might suppose that there was something in them so terrific as to drive the rest of the composition, not only the attendant big leg boys, but the clouds and flowers and pillars too. In short, the very body and soul of allegory, and all the brains. It has stark mad. It happens surely that everyone who comes into the darkened room and looks at these things looks up at the Romang, and that he is invested in all eyes with mystery and awe, as if he were a paralyzed dumb witness. So it shall happen surely through many years to come that ghostly stories shall be told of the stain upon the floor, so easy to be covered, so hard to be got out, and that the Romang pointing from the ceiling shall point so long as dust and damp and spiders spare him, with far greater significance than he ever had in Mr. Tulkinghorn's time, and with a deadly meaning. For Mr. Tulkinghorn's time is over forevermore, and the Romang pointed at the murderous hand, uplifted against his life, and pointed helplessly at him from night to morning, lying face downward on the floor, shot through the heart. Chapter 49. Beautiful friendship. A great annual occasion has come round in the establishment of Mr. Matthew Bagnet, otherwise Ligname Vita, ex-artilleryman and present bassoon player. An occasion of feasting and festival, the celebration of a birthday in the family. It is not Mr. Magnet's birthday. Mr. Magnet merely distinguishes that epoch in the musical instrument business by kissing the children with an extra smack before breakfast, smoking an additional pipe after dinner, and wondering towards evening what his poor old mother is thinking about it, a subject of infinite speculation and rendered so by his mother having departed this life 20 years. Some men rarely revert to their father, but seem in the bank books of their remembrance to have transferred all the stock of filial affection into their mother's name. Mr. Magnet is one of these. Perhaps his exalted appreciation of the merits of the old girl causes him usually to make the noun substantive goodness of the feminine gender. It is not the birthday of one of the three children. Those occasions are kept with some marks of distinction, but they rarely overleap the bounds of happy returns and a putting on young wool, which his last birthday Mr. Magnet certainly did. After observing on his growth and general advancement, proceed in a moment of profound reflection on the changes wrought by time, to examine him in the catechism, accomplishing with extreme accuracy the questions no. 1 and 2, what is your name, and who gave you that name? But they're failing in the exact precision of his memory and substituting for no. 3, the question, and how do you like that name? Which he proclaimed with a sense of its importance in itself, so edifying and improving as to give it quite an orthodox air. This, however, was a specialty on that particular birthday, and not a general solemnity. It is the old girl's birthday, and that is the greatest holiday and reddest letter day in Mr. Magnet's calendar. The auspicious event is always commemorated according to certain forms settled and prescribed by Mr. Bagnet some years since. Mr. Magnet, being deeply convinced that to have a pair of fowls for dinner is to attain the highest pitch of imperial luxury, invariably goes forth himself very early in the morning of this day to buy a pair. He is as invariably taken in by the vendor and installed in the possession of the oldest inhabitants of any coop in Europe, returning with these triumphs of toughness tied up in a clean blue and white cotton handkerchief. Essential to the arrangements, he in a casual manner invites Mrs. Bagnet to declare at breakfast what she would like for dinner. Mrs. Magnet, by a coincidence never known to fail, replying fowls. Mr. Magnet instantly produces his bundle from a place of concealment amidst general amazement and rejoicing. He further requires that the old girl shall do nothing all day long but sit in her very best gown and be served by himself and the young people. As he is not illustrious for his cookery, this may be supposed to be a matter of state rather than enjoyment on the old girl's part, but she keeps her state with all imaginable cheerfulness. On this present birthday, Mr. Magnus has accomplished the usual preliminaries. He has bought 2 specimens of poultry, which, if there be any truth in adages, was certainly not caught with chaff, to be prepared for the spit. He has amazed and rejoiced the family by their unlooked-for production. He is himself directing the roasting of the poultry, and Mrs. Bagnet, with her wholesome brown fingers itching to prevent what she sees going wrong, sits in her gown of ceremony, an honored guest. Quebec and Malta lay the cloth for dinner, while Woolwich, serving as befits him under his father, keeps the fowls revolving. Do these young scallions Mrs. Bagnet occasionally impart a wink or a shake of the head or a crooked face, as they made mistakes at half after one, says Mr. Magnet. To the minute they'll be done. Mrs. Magnet, with anguish, beholds one of them at a standstill before the fire and beginning to burn. You shall have a dinner, old girl, says Mr. Magnet, fit for a queen. Mrs. Bagnet shows her white teeth cheerfully, but to the perception of her son betrays so much uneasiness of spirit that he is impelled by the dictates of affection to ask her with his eyes what is the matter, thus standing with his eyes wide open, more oblivious of the fowls than before, and not affording the least hope of a return to consciousness. Fortunately, his elder sister perceives the cause of the agitation in Mrs. Barnett's breast, and with an admonitory poke recalls him. The stopped fowls going round again. Mrs. Bagnet closes her eyes in the intensity of her relief. George will look us up, says Mr. Magnet at half after 4 to the moment. How many years old girl has George looked us up this afternoon? I'll ligem, as many as make an old woman of a young one. I begin to think just about that, and no less, returns Mrs. Magnet, laughing and shaking her head. Old girl, says Mr. Magnet, never mind, you be as young as ever you was, if you wasn't younger, which you are, as everybody knows. Quebec. And Walter here exclaim with clapping of hands that Bluffy is sure to bring mother something, and begin to speculate on what it will be. Do you know, Lightem, says Mrs. Bagnet, casting a glance on the tablecloth and winking salt at Malton with her right eye and shaking the pepper away from Quebec with her head. I begin to think George is in the roving way again. George, returns Mr. Bagnet, will never desert and leave his old comrade in the lurch. Don't be afraid of it. No, Lincoln, no, I don't say he will. I don't think he will. But if he could get over this money trouble of his, I believe he would be off. Mr. Bagnet asks why. Well, returns his wife, considering George seems to me to be getting not a little impatient and restless. I don't say, but what, he's as free as ever. Of course he must be free or he wouldn't be George, but he's smart and seems put out. He's extra drilled, says Mr. Magnet, by a lawyer who would put the devil out. There's something in that. His wife assents, but so it is. Ligname. Further conversation is prevented for the time by the necessity under which Mr. Magnet finds himself of directing the whole force of his mind to the dinner, which is a little endangered by the dry humor of the fowls in not yielding any gravy, and also by the made gravy acquiring no flavor and turning out of a flaxen complexion. With a similar perverseness, the potatoes crumble off forks in the process of peeling up, heaving from their centers in every direction, as if they were subject to earthquakes. The legs of the fowls too are longer than could be desired, and extremely scaly. Overcoming these disadvantages to the best of his ability, Mr. Bagnet at last dishes, and they sit down at table, Mrs. Bagnet occupying the guest's place at his right hand. It is well for the old girl that she has but one birthday in a year, for to such indulgences in poultry might be injurious. Every kind of finer tendon and ligament that is in the nature of poultry to possess is developed in these specimens. In the singular form of guitar strings, their limbs appear to have struck roots into their breasts and bodies, as aged trees strike roots into the earth. Their legs are so hard as to encourage the idea that they must have devoted the greater part of their long and arduous lives to pedestrian exercises and the walking of matches. But Mr. Magnet, unconscious of these little defects, sets his heart on Mrs. Magnet eating a most severe quantity of the delicacies before her, and as that good old girl would not cause him a moment's disappointment on any day, least of all on such a day, for any consideration she imperils her digestion fearfully. How young Woollett cleans the drumsticks without being of ostrich descent. His anxious mother is at a loss to understand the old girl has another trial to undergo. After the conclusion of the repast, in sitting in state, to see the room cleared, the hearth swept, and the dinner service washed up and polished in the backyard, the great delight and energy with which the two young ladies apply themselves to these duties, turning up their skirts in imitation of their mother, and skating in and out on little scaffolds of patterns, inspire the highest hopes for the future. But some anxiety for the present. The same causes lead to confusion of tongues, a clattering of crockery, a rattling of tin mugs, a whisking of brooms, and an expenditure of water, all in excess, while the saturation of the young ladies themselves is almost too moving a spectacle for Mrs. Bagnet to look upon with the calmness proper to her position. At last the various cleansing processes are triumphantly completed. Quebec and Malta appear in fresh attire, smiling, and dry pipes, tobacco, and something to drink are placed upon the table, and the old girl enjoys the first piece of mind she ever knows on the day of this delightful entertainment. When Mr. Magnet takes his usual seat, the hands of the clock are very near to 4:30 as they mark it accurately. Mr. Magnet announces George military time. It is George, and he has hearty congratulations for the old girl, whom he kisses on the great occasion, and for the children, and for Mr. Magnet. Happy returns to all, says Mr. George. But George, old man, cries Mrs. Magnet, looking at him curiously. What's come to you? Come to me. Oh, you are so white, George, for you, and look so shocked. Now don't he ligname George, says Mr. Magnet. Tell the old girl what's the matter. I didn't know I looked white, says the trooper, passing his hand over his brow, and I didn't know I looked shocked. and I'm sorry I do, but the truth is that boy who was taken in at my place died yesterday afternoon. And it has rather knocked me over, poor creature, says Mrs. Magnet with a mother's pity. Is he gone? Dear, I didn't mean to say anything about it, for it's not birthday talk. But you have got it out of me, you see. Before I sit down I should have roused up in a minute, says the trooper, making himself speak more gaily. But you're so quick, Mrs. Magnet, you're right. The old girl, says Mr. Magnet, is as quick as powder. And what's more, she's the subject of the day, and will stick to her, cries Mr. George. See here, I brought a little brooch along with me. It's a poor thing, you know, but it's a keepsake, that's all the good it is. Mrs. Magnet. Mr. George produces his present, which is greeted with admiring leapings and clappings by the young family, and with a species of reverential admiration by Mr. Magnet. Old girl, says Mr. Magnet, tell him my opinion of it. Why, it's a wonder, George, Mrs. Magnet exclaims. It's the beautifulest thing that ever was seen. Good, says Mr. Magnet. My opinion, it's so pretty, George, cries Mrs. Magnet, turning it on all sides and holding it out at arm's length. But it seems too choice for me. Bad, says Mr. Magnet. Not my opinion, but whatever it is, 100,000 thanks, old fellow, says Mrs. Magnet, her eyes sparkling with pleasure and her hands stretched out to him. And though I have been a cross-grained soldier's wife to you sometimes, George, we are as strong friends, I am sure, in reality as ever can be. Now you shall fasten it on yourself for good luck, if you will, George. The children close up to see it done, and Mr. Magnet looks over young Willock's head to see it done with an interest so maturely wooden yet pleasantly childish that Mrs. Magnet cannot help laughing in her airy way and saying, "Oh, Ligdom, what a precious old chap you are." But the trooper fails to fasten the brooch. His hand shakes. He is nervous, and it falls off. Would anyone believe this, says he, catching it as it drops, and looking round. I am so out of sorts that I bungle at an easy job like this. Mrs. Magnet concludes that for such a case there is no remedy like a pipe and fastening the brooch herself in a twinkling. Causes the trooper to be inducted into his usual snug place, and the pipes to be got into action. If that don't bring you round, George, says she, just throw your eye across here at your present now, and then and the two together must do it. You ought to do it of yourself, George answers. I know that very well, Mrs. Magnet. I'll tell you how. One way and another the blues have got to be too many for me. It was this poor lad. 'Twas dull work to see him dying as he did and not be able to help him. What do you mean, George? You did help him. You took him under your roof. I helped him so far, but that's little. I mean, Mrs. Magnet, there he was dying without ever having been taught much more than to know his right hand from his left, and he was too far gone to be helped out of that. Oh, poor creature, says Mrs. Magnet. Then says the trooper, not yet lighting his pipe and passing his heavy hand over his hair, that brought up gridly in a man's mind. His was a bad case too, in a different way than the to got mixed up in a man's mind with a flinty old rascal who had to do with both. And to think of that rusty carbine stock and barrel standing up on end in his corner, hard indifferent, taking everything so evenly. Oh, it made flesh and blood tingle. I do assure you, my advice to you, returns Mrs. Magnet, is to light your pipe and tingle that way. It's wholesomer and comfortabler and better for the health altogether. You're right, says the trooper, and I'll do it. So he does it, though still with an indignant gravity that impresses the young Bagnets, and even causes Mr. Bagnet to defer the ceremony of drinking Mrs. Bagnet's health, always given by himself on these occasions in a speech of exemplary terseness. But the young ladies having composed what Mr. Magnet is in the habit of calling the mixture, and George's pipe being now in a glow, Mr. Magnet considered it his duty to proceed to the toast of the evening. He addresses the assembled company in the following terms: George Bullock, Quebec, Malta. This is her birthday. Take a day's march, and you won't find such another. Here's towards her. The toast having been drunk with enthusiasm, Mrs. Magnet returns thanks in a neat address of corresponding brevity. This model composition is limited to the 3 words, "and wishing yours," which the old girl follows up with a nod at everybody in the succession and a well-regulated swig of the mixture. This she again follows up on the present occasion by the wholly unexpected exclamation, "Here's a man," much to the astonishment of the little company. Looking in at the parlor door, he is a sharp-eyed man, a quick, keen man, and he takes in everybody's look. At him all at once, individually and collectively, in a manner that stamps him a remarkable man. "George," says the man, nodding, How'd you find yourself? Why, it's Bucket, cries Mr. George. Yes, says the man, coming in and closing the door. I was going down the street here when I happened to stop and look in at the musical instruments in the shop window. A friend of mine is in want of a second-hand violoncello of a good tone, and I saw a party enjoying themselves, and I thought it was you in the corner. I thought I couldn't be mistaken. How goes the world with you, George? At the present moment, pretty smooth. And with you, ma'am, and with you, governor and lord, says Mr. Bucket, opening his arms. Here's children, to you may do anything with me if you only show me children. Give us a kiss, my pets. No occasion to inquire who your father and mother is. Never saw such a likeness in my life. Mr. Bucket, not unwelcome, has sat himself down next to Mr. George and taken Quebec and Malta on his knees. You pretty dears, says Mr. Bucket, give us another kiss. It's the only thing I'm greedy in. Lord bless you, how healthy you look. And what may be the ages of these two, ma'am? I should put them down at the figures of about 8 and 10. You're very near, sir, says Mrs. Magnet. I generally am near, returns Mr. Bucket, being so fond of children. A friend of mine has had 19 of 'em, mom, all by one mother, and she's still as fresh and rosy as the morning. Not so much so as yourself, but upon my soul, she comes near you. And what do you call these, my darling, pursues Mr. Bucket, pinching Malta's cheeks. These are peaches, these are, bless your heart. And what do you think about father? Do you think father could recommend a second-hand wine cellar of a good tone for Mr. Bucket's friend? My dear, my name's Bucket, ain't that a funny name? These blandishments have entirely won the family heart. Mrs. Bagnet forgets the day to the extent of filling a pipe and a glass for Mr. Bucket, and waiting upon him hospitably. She would be glad to receive so pleasant a character under any circumstances. But she tells him that as a friend of George's, she is particularly glad to see him this evening, for George has not been in his usual spirits. Not in his usual spirits, exclaims Mr. Bucket. Why, I had never heard of such a thing. What's the matter, George? You don't intend to tell me you've been out of spirits? What should you be out of spirits for? You haven't got anything on your mind. You know, nothing particular, returns the trooper. I should think not, rejoins Mr. Bucket. What could you have on your mind, you know? And have these pets got anything on their minds? Not they, but they'll be upon the minds of some of the young fellers some of these days, and make 'em precious low-spirited. I ain't much of a prophet, but I can tell you that Mrs. Magnet quite charmed. Hopes Mr. Bucket has a family of his own there, ma'am, says Mr. Bucket. Would you believe it? No, I haven't. My wife and a lodger constitute my family. Mrs. Bucket is as fond of children as myself, and as wishful to have them. But no, so it is, worldly goods are divided unequally, and man must not repine. What a very nice backyard, mom. Any way out of that yard now? There is no way out of that yard. Ain't there really, says Mr. Bucket. I should have thought there might have been. Well, I don't know as I ever saw a backyard that took my fancy more. Would you allow me to look at it? Thank you, no. I see there's no way out, but what a very good proportion yard it is. Having cast a sharp eye all about it, Mr. Bucket returns to his chair next his friend Mr. George and pats Mr. George affectionately on the shoulder. How are your spirits now, George? All right now, returns the trooper. That's your sort, says Mr. Bucket. Why should you ever have been otherwise? A man of your fine figure and constitution has no right to be out of spirits. That ain't a chest to be out of spirits, is it, ma'am? And you haven't got anything on your mind, you know, George. What could you have on your mind? Somewhat harping on this phrase, considering the extent and variety of his conversational powers, Mr. Bucket twice or thrice repeats it to the pipe he likes, and with a listening face that is particularly his own. But the sun of his sociability soon recovers from this brief eclipse and shines again. And this is brother, is it, my dears, says Mr. Bucket, referring to Quebec and Malta for information on the subject of young Woolwich. And a nice brother he is, half-brother I mean to say, for he's too old to be your boy, ma'am. I can certify at all events that he is not anybody else's, returns Mrs. Magnet, laughing. Well, you do surprise me, yet he's like you, there's no denying, Lord, he's wonderfully like you. But about what you make all the brow, you know, there his father comes out. Mr. Bucket compares the faces, with one eye shut up, while Mr. Magnet smokes in stolid satisfaction. This is an opportunity for Mrs. Magnet to inform him that the boy is George's godson. George's godson, is he, rejoins Mr. Bucket with extreme cordiality. I must shake hands over again with George's godson. Godfather and godson do credit to one another. And what do you intend to make of him, ma'am? Does he show any turn for any musical instrument? Mr. Magnet suddenly interposes, plays the fife beautiful. Would you believe it, Governor, says Mr. Bucket, struck by the coincidence. But when I was a boy, I played the fife myself, not in a scientific way, as I expect he does, but by ear. Lord bless you, British Grenadiers, there's a tune to warm an Englishman up. Could you give us British Grenadiers, my fine feller? Nothing could be more acceptable to the little circle than this call upon young Woollock, who immediately fetches his fife and performs the stirring melody, during which performance Mr. Bucket, much enlivened, beats time and never fails to come in sharp with the burden British Grenadiers. In short, he shows so much musical taste that Mr. Magnet actually takes his pipe from his lips to express his conviction that he is a singer. Mr. Bucket receives the harmonious impeachment, so modestly confessing how he did once chaunt a little for the expression of the feelings of his own bosom, and with no presumptuous idea of entertaining his friends that he is asked to sing, not to be behindhand in the society of the evening, he complies, and gives them, believe me, if all those endearing young charms. This ballad, he informs Mrs. Bagnet, he considers to have been his most powerful ally in moving the heart of Mrs. Bucket when a maiden, and inducing her to approach the altar. Mr. Bucket's own words are to come up to the scratch. The sparkling stranger is such a new and agreeable feature in the evening that Mr. George, who testified no great emotions of pleasure on his entrance, begins in spite of himself to be rather proud of him. He is so friendly, is a man of so many resources, and so easy to get on with, that it is something to have made him known there. Mr. Magnet becomes, after another pipe, so sensible of the value of his acquaintance that he solicits the honor of his company on the old girl's next birthday. If anything can more closely cement and consolidate the esteem which Mr. Bucket has formed for the family, it is the discovery of the nature of the occasion. He drinks to Mrs. Magnet with a warmth approaching to rapture, engages himself for that day 12 months, more than thankfully makes a memorandum of the day in a large black pocket book with a girdle to it, and breathes a hope that Mrs. Bucket and Mrs. Magnet may before then become, in a manner, sisters, as he says himself. What is public life without private ties? He is in his humble way a public man, but it is not in that sphere that he finds happiness. No, it must be sought within the confines of domestic bliss. It is natural under these circumstances that he in his turn should remember the friend to whom he is indebted for so promising an acquaintance, and he does. He keeps very close to him, whatever the subject of the conversation. He keeps a tender eye upon him. He waits to walk home with him. He is interested in his very boots, and observes even them attentively as Mr. George sits smoking cross-legged in the chimney corner. At length Mr. George rises to depart. At the same moment Mr. Bucket, with a secret sympathy of friendship, also rises. He dotes upon the children to the last, and remembers the commission he has undertaken for an absent friend respecting that second hand while in cello. Governor, could you recommend me such a thing? Scale, says Mr. Magnet, I am obliged to you, returns Mr. Bucket, squeezing his hand. You're a friend indeed, a good tone. Mind you, my friend is a regular dab at it. He cuts away at Mozart and Handel and the rest of the big wigs like a thorough workman, and you needn't, says Mr. Bucket in a considerate and private voice, you needn't commit yourself to the lower figure. Governor, I don't want to pay too large a price for my friend, but I want you to have your proper percentage and be remunerated for your loss of time. That is but fair. Every man must live, and ought to it. Mr. Bagnet shakes his head at the old girl to the effect that they have found a jewel of price. Suppose I was to give you a look and say at 10:30 tomorrow morning, perhaps you could name the figures of a few violin sellers of a good tone, says Mr. Bucket. Nothing easier. Mr. and Mrs. Magnet both engaged to have the requisite information ready, and even hint to each other at the practicability of having a small stock collected. Therefore, approval. Thank you, says Mr. Bucket. Thank you. Good night, ma'am. Good night, Governor. Good night, darlings. Am much obliged to you for one of the pleasantest evenings I ever spent in my life. They, on the contrary, are much obliged to him for the pleasure he has given them in his company, and so they part with many expressions of goodwill on both sides. Now, George, old boy, says Mr. Bucket, taking his arm at the shop door, come along. As they go down the little street, and the Bagnets pause for a minute looking after them, Mrs. Bagnet remarks to the worthy Ligman that Mr. Bucket almost clings to George like, and seems to be really fond of him, the neighboring streets being narrow and ill-paved it is a little inconvenient to walk there two abreast, and arm in arm. Mr. George therefore soon proposes to walk singly, but Mr. Bucket, who cannot make up his mind to relinquish his friendly hold, replies, "Wait half a minute, George, I should wish to speak to you first immediately." Afterwards he twists him into a public house and into a parlor, where he confronts him and claps his own back against the door. "Now, George," says Mr. Bucket, "duty is duty, and friendship is friendship. I never want the two to clash if I can help it. I have endeavored to make things pleasant tonight, and I put it to you, whether I have done it or not, you must consider yourself in custody." "George, custody? What for?" returns the trooper, thunderstruck. "Now, George," says Mr. Bucket, urging a sensible view of the case upon him, with his fat forefinger, "duty, as you know very well, is one thing, and conversation is another. It's my duty to inform you that any observations you may make will be liable to be used against you. Therefore, George, be careful what you say. You don't happen to have heard of a murder?" "Now, George," says Mr. Bucket, keeping his forefinger in an impressive state of action, "bear in mind what I've said to you. I ask you nothing. You've been in low spirits this afternoon. I say you don't happen to have heard of a murder." "No, where's there been a murder?" "Now, George," says Mr. Bucket, "don't you go and commit yourself. I'm going to tell you what I want you for. There has been a murder in Lincoln's Inn Fields. Gentleman of the name of Tulkinghorn, he was shot last night. I want you for that." The trooper sinks upon a seat behind him, and great drops start out upon his forehead, and a deadly pallor overspreads his face. "Bucket, it's not possible that Mr. Tulkinghorn has been killed, and that you suspect me?" George returns, Mr. Bucket, keeping his forefinger going, "It is certainly possible, because it's the case. This deed was done last night at 10 o'clock. Now you know where you were last night at 10 o'clock, and you'll be able to prove it, no doubt." Last night," repeats the trooper thoughtfully. Then it flashes upon him, "Why, great heaven, I was there last night." "So I have understood, George," returns Mr. Bucket with great deliberation. "So I have understood. Likewise, you've been very often there. You've been seen hanging about the place, and you've been heard more than once in a wrangle with him. And it's possible, I don't say it's certainly so, mind you, but it's possible that he may have been heard to call you a threatening, murdering, dangerous fellow." The trooper gasps as if he would admit it all if he could speak. "Now, George," continues Mr. Bucket, putting his hat upon the table with an air of business rather in the upholstery way than otherwise, "my wish is, as it has been all the evening, to make things pleasant. I tell you plainly, there's a reward out of 100 guineas offered by Sir Lester Dedlock, Baronet. You and me have always been pleasant together, but I have got a duty to discharge, and if that 100 guineas is to be made, it may as well be made by me as any other man, on all of which accounts I should hope it was clear to you that I must have you, and that I'm damned if I don't have you. Am I to call in any assistance, or is the trick done?" Mr. George has recovered himself and stands up like a soldier. "Come," he says, "I am ready." "George," continues Mr. Bucket, "wait a bit," with his upholster a manner as if the trooper were a window to be fitted up. He takes from his pocket a pair of handcuffs. "This is a serious charge, George, and such is my duty." The trooper flushes angrily and hesitates a moment, but holds out his two hands clasped together and says, "They're put 'em on." Mr. Bucket adjusts them in a moment. "How do you find them? Are they comfortable? If not, say so, for I wish to make things as pleasant as is consistent with my duty. And I've got another pair in my pocket." This remark he offers like a most respectable tradesman anxious to execute an order neatly, and to the perfect satisfaction of his customer. "They'll do as they are very well. Now you see, George," he takes a cloak from a corner and begins adjusting it about the trooper's neck, "I was mindful of your feelings when I come out and brought this on purpose. There, who's the wiser only I," returns the trooper, "but as I know it, do me one more good turn and pull my hat over my eyes. Really though, do you mean it? Ain't it a pity it looks so? I can't look chance men in the face with these things on." Mr. George hurriedly replies, "Do for God's sake pull my hat forward," so strongly entreated. Mr. Bucket complies, puts his own hat on, and conducts his prize into the streets, the trooper marching on as steadily as usual, though with his head less erect, and Mr. Bucket steering him with his elbow over the crossings and up the turnings. Chapter 50. Esther's narrative. "It happened that when I came home from Deal, I found a note from Caddy Jellaby, as we always continue to call her, informing me that her health, which had been for some time very delicate, was worse and that she would be more glad than she could tell me if I would go to see her. It was a note of a few lines written from the couch on which she lay, and enclosed to me in another from her husband in which he seconded her entreaty. With much solicitude, Caddy was now the mother, and I the godmother of such a poor little baby, such a tiny old-faced mite with a countenance that seemed to be scarcely anything but cap border, and a little lean long-fingered hand always clenched under its chin. It would lie in this attitude all day, with its bright specks of eyes open, wondering, as I used to imagine, how it came to be so small and weak. Whenever it was moved it cried, but at all other times it was so patient that the sole desire of its life appeared to be to lie quiet and think. It had curious little dark veins in its face and curious little dark marks under its eyes, like faint memories of poor Caddy's inky days, and altogether to those who were not used to it, it was quite a piteous little sight. But it was enough for Caddy that she was used to it. The projects with which she beguiled her illness were little Esther's education, and little Esther's marriage, and even for her own old age, as the grandmother of little Esther's was so prettily expressive of devotion to this pride of her life, that I should be tempted to recall some of them, but for the timely remembrance that I am getting on irregularly, as it is to return to the letter. Caddy had a superstition about me which had been strengthening in her mind ever since that night long ago, when she had lain asleep with her head in my lap. She almost, I think I must say, quite believed that I did her good whenever I was near her now, although this was such a fancy of the affectionate girls that I am almost ashamed to mention it. Still, it might have all the force of a fact when she was really ill. Therefore I set off to Caddy with my guardian's consent post haste, and she and Prince made so much of me that there was never anything like it. Next day I went again to sit with her, and next day I went again. It was a very easy journey, for I had only to rise a little earlier in the morning and keep my accounts and attend to housekeeping matters before leaving home. But when I had made these 3 visits, my guardian said to me on my return at night, "Now, little woman, this will never do. Constant dropping will wear away a stone, and constant coaching will wear out a Dame Durden. We will go to London for a while, and take possession of our old lodgings." "Not for me, dear guardian," said I, "for I never feel tired," which was strictly true. I was only too happy to be in such request for me. Then returned my guardian, "Or for Ada, or for both of us. It is somebody's birthday tomorrow, I think. Truly, I think it is," said I, kissing my darling, who would be 21 tomorrow. "Well observed, my guardian, half pleasantly, half seriously. That's a great occasion, and will give my fair cousin some necessary business to transact, an assertion of her independence, and will make London a more convenient place for all of us. So to London we will go. That being settled, there is another thing. How have you left Caddy? "Very unwell, guardian. I fear it will be some time before she regains her health and strength." "What do you call some time now?" asked my guardian thoughtfully. "Some weeks, I am afraid." He began to walk about the room with his hands in his pockets, showing that he had been thinking as much. "Now, what do you say about her doctor? Is he a good doctor?" "My love," I felt obliged to confess that I knew nothing to the contrary, but that Prince and I had agreed only that evening that we would like his opinion to be confirmed by someone. "Well, you know," returned my guardian quickly, "there's Woodcourt." I had not meant that, and was rather taken by surprise. For a moment all that I had had in my mind in connection with Mr. Woodcourt seemed to come back and confuse me. "You don't object to him, little woman?" "Object to him, guardian? Oh no. And you don't think the patient would object to him?" So far from that, I had no doubt of her being prepared to have a great reliance on him, and to like him very much. I said that he was no stranger to her personally, for she had seen him often in his kind attendance on Miss Flight. "Very good," said my guardian. "He has been here today, my dear, and I will see him about it tomorrow." I felt in this short conversation, though I did not know how, for she was quiet, and we interchanged no look, but my dear girl well remembered how merrily she had clasped me round the waist when no other hands than Caddy's had brought me the little parting token. This caused me to feel that I ought to tell her, and Caddy too, that I was going to be the mistress of Bleak House, and that if I avoided that disclosure any longer I might become less worthy in my own eyes of its master's love. Therefore, when we went upstairs and had waited listening until the clock struck 12, in order that only I might be the first to wish my darling all good wishes on her birthday, and to take her to my heart, I set before her, just as I had set before myself, the goodness and honor of her cousin John, and the happy life that was in store for me. If ever my darling were fonder of me at one time then another in all our intercourse. She was surely fonder of me that night, and I was so rejoiced to know it, and so comforted by the sense of having done right in casting this last idle reservation away, that I was 10 times happier than I had been before I had scarcely thought it a reservation a few hours ago. But now that it was gone, I felt as if I understood its nature better. Next day we went to London. We found our old lodging vacant, and in half an hour were quietly established there as if we had never gone away. Mr. Woodcourt dined with us to celebrate my darling's birthday, and we were as pleasant as we could be with the great blank among us that Richard's absence naturally made on such an occasion. After that day, I was for some weeks 8 or 9, as I remember, very much with Caddy, and thus it fell out that I saw less of Ada at this time than any other since we had first come together. Except the time of my own illness, she often came to Caddy's, but our function there was to amuse and cheer her, and we did not talk in our usual confidential manner whenever I went home at night. We were together, but Caddy's rest was broken by pain, and I often remained to nurse her with her husband and her poor little mite of a baby to love, and their home to strive for. What a good creature Caddy was, so self-denying, so uncomplaining, so anxious to get well on their account, so afraid of giving trouble, and so thoughtful of the unassisted labors of her husband and the comforts of old Mr. Turvey Drop. I had never known the best of her until now, and it seemed so curious that her pale face and helpless figure should be lying there day after day, where dancing was the business of life, where the kit and the apprentices began early every morning in the ballroom, and where the untidy little boy walled by himself in the kitchen all the afternoon. At Caddy's request, I took the supreme direction of her apartment, trimmed it up, and pushed her couch and all into a lighter and more airy and more cheerful corner than she had yet occupied. Then every day, when we were in our neatest array, I used to lay my small namesake in her arms and sit down to chat or work or read to her. It was at one of the first of these quiet times that I told Caddy about Bleak House. We had other visitors besides Ada. First of all, we had Prince, who in his hurried intervals of teaching used to come softly in and sit softly down with a face of loving anxiety for Caddy, and the very little child, whatever Caddy's condition really was, she never failed to declare to Prince that she was all but well, which I, heaven forgive me, never failed to confirm. This would put Prince in such good spirits that he would sometimes take the kit from his pocket and play a chord or two to astonish the baby, which I never knew it to do in the least degree, for my tiny namesake never noticed it at all. Then there was Mrs. Jellaby. She would come occasionally with her usual distort manner and sit calmly looking miles beyond her grandchild, as if her attention were absorbed by a young borer bullen on its native shores, as bright-eyed as ever, as serene and as untidy. She would say, "Well, Caddy, child, and how do you do today?" and then would sit amiably smiling and taking no notice of the reply, or would sweetly glide off into a calculation of the number of letters she had lately received and answered, or of the coffee-bearing power of Bori Balgar. This she would always do with a serene contempt for our limited sphere of action, not to be disguised. Then there was old Mr. Turvey Drop, who was from morning to night, and from night to morning, the subject of innumerable precautions. If the baby cried, it was nearly stifled, lest the noise should make him uncomfortable. If a fire wanted stirring in the night, it was surreptitiously done, lest his rest should be broken. If Caddy required any little comfort that the house contained, she first carefully discussed whether he was likely to require it too. In return for this consideration, he would come into the room once a day, all but blessing it, showing a condescension and a patronage and a grace of manner in dispensing the light of his high-shouldered presence, from which I might have supposed him, if I had not known better, to have been the benefactor of Caddy's life. "My Caroline," he would say, making the nearest approach that he could to bending over her, "tell me that you are better today." "Oh, much better, thank you, Mr. Turvey Drop," Caddy would reply, delighted, enchanted. "And our dear Miss Somerset, she is not quite prostrated by fatigue." Here he would crease up his eyelids and kiss his fingers to me, though I am happy to say he had ceased to be particular in his attentions, since I had been so altered. "Not at all," I would assure him. Charming, we must take care of our dear Carolyn, Miss Summerson. We must spare nothing that will restore her. We must nourish her, my dear Carolyn. He would turn to his daughter-in-law with infinite generosity and protection. Want for nothing, my love. Frame a wish and gratify it, my daughter. Everything this house contains, everything my room contains, is at your service, my dear. Do not, he would sometimes add in a burst of deportment, even allow my simple requirements to be considered if they should at any time interfere with your own, my Carolyn. Your necessities are greater than mine. He had established such a long prescriptive right to this deportment, his son's inheritance from his mother, that I several times knew both Caddy and her husband to be melted to tears by these affectionate self-sacrifices. Nay, my dears, he would remonstrate, and when I saw Caddy's thin arm about his fat neck as he said it, I would be melted to, though not by the same process. Nay, nay, I have promised never to leave you. Be dutiful and affectionate towards me, and I ask no other return. Now bless you, I am going to the park. He would take the air there presently and get an appetite for his hotel dinner. I hope I do old Mr. Turvey drop no wrong. But I never saw any better traits in him than these I faithfully record, except that he certainly conceived a liking for Peepee, and would take the child out walking with great pomp, always on those occasions sending him home before he went to dinner, himself, and occasionally with a halfpenny in his pocket. But even this disinterestedness was attended with no inconsiderable cost to my knowledge, for before Peepee was sufficiently decorated to walk hand in hand with the professor of deportment, he had to be newly dressed at the expense of Caddy and her husband from top to toe. Last of our visitors, there was Mr. Jellaby Reilly, when he used to come in of an evening and ask Caddy in his meek voice how she was, and then sit down with his head against the wall and make no attempt to say anything more. I liked him very much. If he found me bustling about doing any little thing, he sometimes have took his coat off as if with an intention of helping by a great exertion, but he never got any further. His sole occupation was to sit with his head against the wall, looking hard at the thoughtful baby, and I could not quite divest my mind of a fancy that they understood one another. I have not counted Mr. Woodcourt among our visitors, because he was now Caddy's regular attendant. She soon began to improve under his care, but he was so gentle, so skillful, so unwearying in the pains he took, that it is not to be wondered at. I am sure I saw a good deal of Mr. Woodcourt during this time, though not so much as might be supposed, for knowing Caddy to be safe in his hands, I often slipped home at about the hours when he was expected. We frequently met. Notwithstanding I was quite reconciled to myself now, but I still felt glad to think that he was sorry for me, and he still was sorry for me. I believed he helped Mr. Badger in his professional engagements, which were numerous, and had as yet no settled projects for the future. It was when Caddy began to recover, but I began to notice a change in my dear girl. I cannot say how it first presented itself to me, because I observed it in many slight particulars, which were nothing in themselves and only became something when they were pieced together. But I made it out by putting them together that Ada was not so frankly cheerful with me as she used to be. Her tenderness for me was as loving and true as ever. I did not for a moment doubt that, but there was a quiet sorrow about her which she did not confide to me, and in which I traced some hidden regret. Now I could not understand this, and I was so anxious for the happiness of my own pet that it caused me some uneasiness, and set me thinking often at length, feeling sure that Ada suppressed this something from me, lest it should make me unhappy too. It came into my head that she was a little grieved for me by what I had told her about Bleak House. How I persuaded myself that this was likely, I don't know. I had no idea that there was any selfish reference in my doing so. I was not grieved for myself. I was quite contented and quite happy still that Ada might be thinking for me, though I had abandoned all such thoughts of what once was, but was now all changed. Seemed so easy to believe that I believed it. What could I do to reassure my darling? I considered then, and show her that I had no such feelings. Well, I could only be as brisk and busy as possible, and that I had tried to be all along. However, as Caddy's illness had certainly interfered more or less with my home duties, though I had always been there in the morning to make my guardian's breakfast, and he had 100 times laughed and said there must be 2 little women, for his little woman was never missing. I resolved to be doubly diligent and gay, so I went about the house humming all the tunes I knew, and I sat working and working in a desperate manner, and I talked and talked morning, noon, and night, and still there was the same shade between me and my darling. So, Dame Trot observed my guardian shutting up his book one night when we were all three together. So Woodcourt has restored Caddy Jelly to the full enjoyment of life again. Yes, I said, and to be repaid by such gratitude as hers, he is to be made rich guardian. I wish it was he returned with all my heart, so did I too for that matter, I said, so, we would make him as rich as a Jew, if we knew, how would we not, little woman? I laughed as I worked, and replied that I was not sure about that, for it might spoil him, and he might not be so useful, and there might be many who could'll spare him, as Miss Flight and Caddy herself, and many others. True, said my guardian, I had forgotten that. But we would agree to make him rich enough to live, I suppose, rich enough to work with tolerable peace of mind, rich enough to have his own happy home, and his own household gods, and household goddess too, perhaps. That was quite another thing, I said. We must all agree in that, to be sure, said my guardian, all of us. I have a great regard for Woodcourt, a high esteem for him, and I have been sounding him delicately about his plans. It is difficult to offer aid to an independent man with that just kind of pride which he possesses, and yet I would be glad to do it if I might, or if I knew how he seems half inclined for another voyage. But that appears like casting such a man away. It might open a new world to him, that I so it might, little woman. My guardian assented. I doubt if he expects much of the old world. Do you know, I have fancy that he sometimes feels some particular disappointment or misfortune encountered in it. You never heard anything of that sort? I shook my head. Said my guardian, I am mistaken, I dare say, as there was a little pause here which I thought for my dear girl's satisfaction had better be filled up. I hummed an air as I worked, which was a favorite with my guardian. And do you think Mr. Woodcourt will make another voyage? I asked him, when I had hummed it quietly all through. I don't quite know what to think, my dear, but I should say it was likely at present that he will give a long trip to another country. I am sure he will take the best wishes of all our hearts with him wherever he goes, said I. And though they are not riches, you will never be the poorer for them, guardian, at least never, little woman, he replied. I was sitting in my usual place, which was now beside my guardian's chair. That had not been my usual place before the letter, but it was now. I looked up to Ada, who was sitting opposite, and I saw as she looked at me that her eyes were filled with tears, and the tears were falling down her face. I felt that I had only to be placid and merry once for all to undeceive my dear and set her loving heart at rest. I really was so, and I had nothing to do but to be myself, so I made my sweet girl lean upon my shoulder, how little thinking what was heavy on her mind, and I said she was not quite well, and put my arm about her and took her upstairs when we were in our own room. And when she might perhaps have told me what I was so unprepared to hear, I gave her no encouragement to confide in me. I never thought she stood in need of it. Oh, my dear good Esther, said Ada, if I could only make up my mind to speak to you and my cousin John when you are together. Why, my love, I remonstrated. Ada, why should you not speak to us? Ada only dropped her head and pressed me closer to her heart. You surely don't forget my beauty, said I, smiling. What quiet old-fashioned people we are, and how I have settled down to be the discreetest of dames. You don't forget how happily and peacefully my life is all marked out for me, and by whom I am certain that you don't forget by what a noble character. Ada, and it can never be. No, never, Esther. Why then, my dear, said I, there can be nothing amiss, and why should you not speak to us? Nothing amiss, Esther, returned Ada. When I think of all these years, and of his fatherly care and kindness, and of the old relations among us, and of you, what shall I do? What shall I do? I looked at my child in some wonder, but I thought it better not to answer otherwise than by cheering her, and so I turned off into many little recollections of our life together, and prevented her from saying more when she lay down to sleep, and not before I returned to my guardian to say good night. And then I came back to Ada and sat near her for a little while she was asleep, and I thought as I looked at her that she was a little changed. I had thought so more than once lately. I could not decide, even looking at her while she was unconscious, how she was changed, but something in the familiar beauty of her face looked different to me. My guardian's old hopes of her and Richard arose sorrowfully in my mind, and I said to myself, she has been anxious about him, and I wondered how that love would end. When I had come home from Caddy's while she was ill, I had often found Ada at work, and she had always put her work away, and I had never known what it was. Some of it now lay in a drawer near her, which was not quite closed. I did not open the drawer, but I still rather wondered what the work could be, for it was evidently nothing for herself, and I noticed as I kissed my dear that she lay with one hand under her pillow, so that it was hidden. How much less amiable I must have been than they thought me, how much less amiable than I thought myself to be, so preoccupied with my own cheerfulness and contentment as to think that it only rested with me to put my dear girl right and set her mind at peace. But I lay down self-deceived in that belief, and I awoke in it next day to find that there was still the same shade between me and my darling. Chapter 51. Enlightened. When Mr. Woodcourt arrived in London, he went that very same day to Mr. Vholes in Simmons' Inn, for he never once from the moment when I entreated him to be a friend to Richard neglected or forgot his promise. He had told me that he accepted the charge as a sacred trust, and he was ever true to it. In that spirit, he found Mr. Vholes in his office and informed Mr. Vholes of his agreement with Richard that he should call there to learn his address. Just so, sir, said Mr. Vholes. Mr. C's address is not 100 miles from here, sir. Mr. C's address is not 100 miles from here. Would you take a seat, sir? Mr. Woodcourt thanked Mr. Vholes, but he had no business with him beyond what he had mentioned. Just so, sir. I believe, sir, said Mr. Vholes, still quietly insisting on the seat, by not giving the address, that you have influence with Mr. C. Indeed, I am aware that you have. I was not aware of it myself, returned Mr. Woodcourt, but I suppose you know best, sir, rejoined Mr. Vholes' self-contained as usual voice, and all it is a part of my professional duty to know best. It is a part of my professional duty to study and to understand a gentleman who confides his interests to me in my professional duty. I shall not be wanting, sir. If I know it, I may with the best intentions be wanting in it without knowing it, but not if I know it, sir. Mr. Woodcourt again mentioned the address. Give me leave, sir, said Mr. Vholes. Bear with me for a moment, sir. Mr. C is playing for a considerable stake and cannot play without need. I say, what money, I presume, sir, said Mr. Vholes. To be honest with you, honesty being my golden rule, whether I gain by it or lose, and I find that I generally lose money, is the word. Now, sir, upon the chances of Mr. C's game, I express to you no opinion. No opinion. It might be highly impolitic in Mr. C, after playing so long and so high, to leave off. It might be the reverse. I say nothing. No, sir, said Mr. Vholes, ringing his hand flat down upon his desk in a positive manner. Nothing. You seem to forget, returned Mr. Woodcourt, that I ask you to say nothing and have no interest in anything you say. Pardon me, sir, retorted Mr. Vholes, you do yourself an injustice. No, sir, pardon me, you shall not in my office. If I know it, do yourself an injustice. You are interested in anything and in everything that relates to your friend. I know human nature much better, sir, than to admit for an instant that a gentleman of your appearance is not interested in whatever concerns his friend. Well, replied Mr. Woodcourt, that maybe I am particularly interested in his address. The number, sir, said Mr. Vholes parenthetically. I believe I have already mentioned if Mr. C is to continue to play for this considerable stake, sir, he must have funds. Understand me, there are funds in hand at present. I ask for nothing. There are funds in hand, but for the onward play more funds must be provided, unless Mr. C is to throw away what he has already ventured, which is wholly and solely a point for his consideration. This, sir, I take the opportunity of stating openly to you as the friend of Mr. C. Without funds I shall always be happy to appear and act for Mr. C. to the extent of all such costs as are safe to be allowed out of the estate. Not beyond that. I could not go beyond that, sir, without wronging someone. I must either wrong my 3 dear girls or my venerable father, who is entirely dependent on me in the Vale of Taunton, or someone, whereas, sir, my resolution is, call it weakness or folly, if you please, to wrong no one. Mr. Woodcourt rather sternly rejoined that he was glad to hear it. I wish, sir, said Mr. Vholes, to leave a good name behind me. Therefore I take every opportunity of openly stating to a friend of Mr. C how Mr. C is situated. As to myself, sir, the laborer is worthy of his hire. If I undertake to put my shoulder to the wheel, I do it, and I earn what I get. I am here for that purpose. My name is painted on the door outside with that object, and Mr. Carstone's address. Mr. Vholes, sir, returned Mr. Vholes, as I believe I have already mentioned, it is next door on the 2nd story. You will find Mr. C's apartments. Mr. C desires to be near his professional advisor, and I am far from objecting, for I court inquiry upon this. Mr. Woodcourt wished Mr. Vholes good day and went in search of Richard. The change in his appearance he began to understand now, but too well he found him in a dull room faintly furnished much as I had found him in his barrack room, but a little while before, except that he was not writing, but was sitting with a book before him from which his eyes and thoughts were far astray. As the door chanced to be standing open, Mr. Woodcourt was in his presence for some moments without being perceived, and he told me that he never could forget the haggardness of his face and the dejection of his manner before he was aroused from his dream. "Woodcourt, my dear fellow," cried Richard, starting up with extended hands. "You come upon my vision like a ghost, a friendly one," he replied, "and only waiting as they say ghosts do to be addressed. How does the mortal world go?" They were seated now near together. "Badly enough and slowly enough," said Richard, "speaking at least for my part of it." "What part is that?" "The Chancery part." "I never heard," returned Mr. Woodcourt, shaking his head, "if it's going well yet." "Nor I," said Richard moodily. "Whoever did." He brightened again in a moment and said with his natural openness, "Woodcourt, I should be sorry to be misunderstood by you, even if I gained by it in your estimation. You must know that I have done no good. This long time I have not intended to do much harm, but I seem to have been capable of nothing else. It may be that I should have done better by keeping out of the net into which my destiny has worked me. But I think not, though I dare say you will soon hear, if you have not already heard, a very different opinion. To make short of a long story, I am afraid I have wanted an object, but I have an object now, or it has me, and it is too late to discuss it. Take me as I am, and make the best of me." "Bargain," said Mr. Woodcourt. "Do as much by me in return." "Oh, you," returned Richard, "you can pursue your art for its own sake, and can put your hand upon the plow and never turn, and can strike a purpose out of anything. You and I are very different creatures." He spoke regretfully, and lapsed for a moment into his weary condition. "Well, well," he cried, shaking it off, "everything has an end. We shall see. So you will take me as I am, and make the best of me." "I indeed, I will." They shook hands upon it, laughingly, but in deep earnestness. "I can answer for one of them, with my heart of hearts. You come as a godsend," said Richard, "for I have seen nobody here yet. But Voles, Woodcourt, there is one subject I should like to mention for once and for all. In the beginning of our treaty, you can hardly make the best of me. If I don't, you know, I dare say, that I have an attachment to my cousin Ada." Mr. Woodcourt replied that I had hinted as much to him. "Now pray," returned Richard, "don't think me a heap of selfishness. Don't suppose that I am splitting my head and half breaking my heart over this miserable chancery suit for my own rights and interests alone. Ada's are bound up with mine. They can't be separated. Voles works for both of us. Do think of that." He was so very solicitous on this head that Mr. Woodcourt gave him the strongest assurances that he did him no injustice. "You see," said Richard, with something pathetic in his manner of lingering on the point, though it was offhand and unstudied to an upright fellow like you, bringing a friendly face like yours here. "I cannot bear the thought of appearing selfish and mean. I want to see Ada written, Woodcourt, as well as myself. I want to do my utmost to write her as well as myself. I venture what I can scrape together to extricate her as well as myself. Do, I beseech you, think of that." Afterwards, when Mr. Woodcourt came to reflect on what had passed, he was so very much impressed by the strength of Richard's anxiety on this point that in telling me generally of his first visit to Simmons' Inn, he particularly dwelt upon it. It revived a fear I had had before, that my dear girl's little property would be absorbed by Mr. Voles, and that Richard's justification to himself would be sincerely this. It was just as I began to take care of Caddy that the interview took place, and I now returned to the time when Caddy had recovered, and the shade was still between me and my darling. I proposed to Ada that morning that we should go and see Richard. It a little surprised me to find that she hesitated, and was not so radiantly willing as I had expected. "My dear," said I, "you have not had any difference with Richard since I have been so much away?" "No, Esther, not heard of him perhaps," said I. "Yes, I have heard of him," said Ada, "such tears in her eyes, and such love in her face. I could not make my darling out. Should I go to Richard's by myself?" I said. "No." Ada thought I had better not go by myself. Would she go with me? Yes. Ada thought she had better go with me. Should we go now? Yes, let us go now. Well, I could not understand my darling with the tears in her eyes and the love in her face. We were soon equipped and went out. It was a somber day, and drops of chill rain fell at intervals. It was one of those colorless days when everything looks heavy and harsh. The houses frowned at us, the dust rose at us, the smoke swooped at us. Nothing made any compromise about itself or wore a softened aspect. I fancied my beautiful girl quite out of place in the rugged streets, and I thought there were more funerals passing along the dismal pavements than I had ever seen before we had first to find out Simon's and we were going to inquire in a shop when Ada said she thought it was near Chancery Lane. "We are not likely to be far out, my love, if we go in that direction," said I. So to Chancery Lane we went, and there sure enough we saw it written up Simmons Inn. We had next to find out the number or Mr. Vols's office will do. I recollected, for Mr. Vols's office is next door, upon which Ada said perhaps that was Mr. Vols's office in the corner there, and it really was. Then came the question, which of the two next doors I was going for, the one, and my darling was going for the other, and my darling was right again. So up we went to the second story. When we came to Richard's name in great white letters on a hearse-like panel, I should have knocked, but Ada said perhaps we had better turn the handle and go, and thus we came to Richard poring over a table covered with dusty bundles of papers, which seemed to me like dusty mirrors reflecting his own mind. Wherever I looked I saw the ominous words that ran in it repeated, "John Dice." And John Dice. He received us very affectionately, and we sat down. "If you had come a little earlier," he said, "you would have found Woodcourt here. There never was such a good fellow as Woodcourt, as he finds time to look in between whiles when anybody else with half his work to do would be thinking about not being able to come. And he is so cheery, so fresh, so sensible, so earnest, so everything that I am not, that the place brightens whenever he comes and darkens whenever he goes again. God bless him," I thought, "for his truth to me. He is not so sanguine." Ada continued Richard, casting his dejected look over the bundles of papers, "as Voles and I are usually. But he is only an outsider and is not in the mysteries. We have gone into them, and he has not. He can't be expected to know much of such a labyrinth." As his look wandered over the papers again, and he passed his two hands over his head, I noticed how sunken and how large his eyes appeared, how dry his lips were, and how his fingernails were all bitten away. "Is this a healthy place to live in, Richard, do you think?" said I. "Why, my dear Minerva," answered Richard with his old gay laugh, "it is neither a rural nor a cheerful place, and when the sun shines here you may lay a pretty heavy wager that it is shining brightly in an open spot. But it's well enough for the time. It's near the offices and near Voles. Perhaps," I hinted, "a change from both might do me good," said Richard, forcing a laugh as he finished the sentence. "I shouldn't wonder, but it can only come in one way now, in one of two ways. I should rather say either the suit must be ended, Esther, or the suitor. But it shall be the suit, my dear girl, the suit, my dear girl." These latter words were addressed to Ada, who was sitting nearest to him, her face being turned away from me and towards him. I could not see it. "We are doing very well," pursued Richard. "Voles will tell you so. We are really spinning along. Ask Voles. We are giving them no rest. Voles knows all their windings and turnings, and we are upon them everywhere. We have astonished them already. We shall rouse up that nest of sleepers. Mark my words." His hopefulness had long been more painful to me than his despondency. It was so unlike hopefulness, had something so fierce in its determination to be. It was so hungry and eager, and yet so conscious of being forced and unsustainable, that it had long touched me to the heart. But the commentary upon it, now indelibly written in his handsome face, made it far more distressing than it used to be. I say indelibly, for I felt persuaded that if the fatal cause could have been forever terminated, according to his brightest visions, in that same hour the traces of the premature anxiety, self-reproach, and disappointment it had occasioned him would have remained upon his features to the hour of his death. "The sight of our dear little woman," said Richard, "Ada still remaining silent and quiet, is so natural to me, and her compassionate face is so like the face of old days." "Ah, no, no," I smiled and shook my head. "So exactly like the face of old days," said Richard in his cordial voice, and taking my hand with the brotherly regard which nothing ever changed. "But I can't make pretenses with her. I fluctuate a little, that's the truth. Sometimes I hope, my dear, and sometimes I don't quite despair, but nearly I get," said Richard, relinquishing my hand gently and walking across the room. So tired he took a few turns up and down and sunk upon the sofa. "I get," he repeated gloomily, "so tired. It is such weary, weary work." He was leaning on his arm, saying these words in a meditative voice and looking at the ground, when my darling Rose put off her bonnet, kneeled down beside him with her golden hair falling like sunlight on his head, clasped her two arms round his neck and turned her face to me. Oh, what a loving and devoted face I saw. Esther dear, she said very quietly, I am not going home again. A light shone in upon me all at once. Never anymore. I am going to stay with my dear husband. We have been married above 2 months. Go home without me, my own Esther. I shall never go home anymore. With those words, my darling drew his head down on her breast and held it there. And if ever in my life I saw love that nothing but death could change, I saw it then before me. Speak to Est, my dearest, said Richard, breaking the silence. Presently tell her how it was I met her before she could come to me, and folded her in my arms. We neither of us spoke, but with her cheek against my own, I wanted to hear nothing. My pet, said I, my love, my poor girl. I pitied her so much. I was very fond of Richard, but the impulse that I had upon me was to pity her so much. Esther, will you forgive me? Will my cousin John forgive me, my dear? Said I. To doubt it for a moment is to do him a great wrong. And as to me, why, as to me, what had I to forgive? I dried my sobbing darling's eyes and sat beside her on the sofa, and Richard sat on my other side. And while I was reminded of that so different night when they had first taken me into their confidence and had gone on in their own wild, happy way, they told me between them how it was all I had was Richard's. Ada said, and Richard would not take it, Esther, and what could I do but be his wife when I loved him dearly, and you were so fully and so kindly occupied? Excellent Dame Durden, said Richard, but how could we speak to you at such a time? And besides, it was not a long considered step. We went out one morning and were married. And when it was done, Esther said, my darling, I was always thinking how to tell you and what to do for the best, and sometimes I thought you ought to know it directly, and sometimes I thought you ought not to know it and keep it from my cousin John, and I could not tell what to do, and I fretted very much. How selfish I must have been not to have thought of this before. I don't know what I said now. I was so sorry, and yet I was so fond of them and so glad that they were fond of me. I pitied them so much, and yet I felt a kind of pride in their loving one another. I never had experienced such painful and pleasurable emotion at one time, and in my own heart I did not know which predominated, but I was not there to darken their way. I did not do that when I was less foolish and more composed. My darling took her wedding ring from her bosom and kissed it and put it on. Then I remembered last night and told Richard that ever since her marriage she had worn it at night when there was no one to see. Then Ada blushingly asked me how did I know that, my dear. Then I told Ada how I had seen her hand concealed under her pillow and had little thought why, my dear. Then they began telling me how it was all over again, and I began to be sorry and glad again and foolish again, and to hide my plain old face as much as I could, lest I should put them out of heart. Thus the time went on until it became necessary for me to think of returning. When that time arrived, it was the worst of all, for then my darling completely broke down. She clung round my neck, calling me by every dear name she could think of, and saying what should she do without me? Nor was Richard much better, and as for me, I should have been the worst of the three if I had not severely said to myself, now Esther, if you do, I'll never speak to you again. Why, I declare, said I never saw such a wife. I don't think she loves her husband at all. Here, Richard, take my child for goodness sake. But I held her tight all the while and could have wept over her. I don't know how long I give this dear young couple notice, said I, that I am only going away to come back tomorrow, and that I shall be always coming backwards and forwards until Simmons is tired of the sight of me. So I shall not say goodbye, Richard, for what would be the use of that, you know, when I am coming back so soon. I had given my darling to him now, and I meant to go, but I lingered for one more look of the precious face, which it seemed to rive my heart to turn from. So I said in a merry, bustling manner, but unless they gave me some encouragement to come back, I was not sure that I could take that liberty. Upon which my dear girl looked up faintly, smiling through her tears, and I folded her lovely face between my hands and gave it one last kiss and laughed and ran away. And when I got downstairs, oh how I cried. It almost seemed to me that I had lost my Ada forever. I was so lonely and so blank without her, and it was so desolate to be going home with no hope of seeing her there, that I could get no comfort for a little while. As I walked up and down in a dim corner sobbing and crying, I came to myself by and by after a little scolding, and took a coach home. The poor boy whom I had found at St. Albans had reappeared a short time before, and was lying at the point of death, indeed was then dead, though I did not know it. My guardian had gone out to inquire about him and did not return to dinner. Being quite alone, I cried a little again, though on the whole I don't think I behaved so very ill. It was only natural that I should not be quite accustomed to the loss of my darling, yet 3 or 4 hours were not a long time after years, but my mind dwelt so much upon the uncongenial scene in which I had left her, and I pictured it as such an overshadowed, stony-hearted one, and I so longed to be near her and taking some sort of care of her that I determined to go back in the evening only to look up at her windows. It was foolish, I dare say, but it did not then seem at all so to me, and it does not seem quite so even now. I took Charlie into my confidence, and we went out at dusk. It was dark when we came to the new, strange home of my dear girl, and there was a light behind the yellow blinds. We walked past cautiously 3 or 4 times, looking up, and narrowly missed encountering Mr. Voles, who came out of his office while we were there and turned his head to look up to before going home. The sight of his lank black figure and the lonesome air of that look in the dark were favorable to the state of my mind. I thought of the youth and love and beauty of my dear girl shut up in such an ill-assorted refuge, almost as if it were a cruel place. It was very solitary and very dull, and I did not doubt that I might safely steal upstairs. I left Charlie below and went up with a light foot, not distressed by any glare from the feeble oil lanterns on the way. I listened for a few moments, and in the musty, rotting silence of the house believed that I could hear the murmur of their young voices. I put my lips to the hearse-like panel of the door as a kiss for my dear, and came quietly down again, thinking that one of these days I would confess to the visit. And it really did me good, for though nobody but Charlie and I knew anything about it, I somehow felt as if it had diminished the separation between Ada and me, and had brought us together again for those moments. I went back, not quite accustomed yet to the change, but all the better for that, hovering about my darling. My guardian had come home and was standing thoughtfully by the dark window when I went in. His face cleared, and he came to his seat, but he caught the light upon my face as I took mine. Little woman, said he, you have been crying. Why, yes, guardian, said I am afraid I have been a little. Ada has been in such distress and is so very sorry, guardian. I put my arm on the back of his chair, and I saw in his glance that my words and my look at her empty place had prepared him. Is she married, my dear? I told him all about it, and how her first entreaties had referred to his forgiveness. She has no need of it, said he. Heaven bless her and her husband. But just as my first impulse had been to pity her, so was his. Poor girl, poor Rick, poor Ada. Neither of us spoke after that, until he said with a sigh, well, my dear, Bleak House is thinning fast, but its mistress remains, guardian. Though I was timid about saying it, I ventured, because of the sorrowful tone in which he had spoken. She will do all she can to make it happy, said I. She will succeed, my love. The letter had made no difference between us, except that the seat by his side had come to be mine. It made none. Now he turned his old bright fatherly look upon me, laid his hand on my hand in his old way, and said again, she will succeed, my dear. Nevertheless, Bleak House is thinning fast. Oh, little woman, I was sorry presently that this was all we said about that. I was rather disappointed. I feared I might not quite have been all I had meant to be since the letter and the answer. Chapter 50 to Obstinacy. But one other day had intervened when, early in the morning, as we were going to breakfast, Mr. Woodcourt came in haste with the astounding news that a terrible murder had been committed, for which Mr. George had been apprehended and was in custody, when he told us that a large reward was offered by Celeste Dedlock for the murderer's apprehension. I did not in my first consternation understand why, but a few more words explained to me that the murdered person was Celeste's lawyer, and immediately my mother's dread of him rushed into my remembrance. This unforeseen and violent removal of one whom she had long watched and distrusted, and who had long watched and distrusted her, one for whom she could have had few intervals of kindness, always dreading in him a dangerous and secret enemy, appeared so awful that my first thoughts were of her. How appalling to hear of such a death and be able to feel no pity. How dreadful to remember, perhaps, that she had sometimes even wished the old man away who was so swiftly hurried out of life. Such crowding reflections, increasing the distress and fear I always felt when the name was mentioned, made me so agitated that I could scarcely hold my place at the table. I was quite unable to follow the conversation until I had had a little time to recover, but when I came to myself and saw how shocked my guardian was, and found that they were earnestly speaking of the suspected man and recalling every favorable impression we had formed of him out of the good we had known of him, my interest and my fears were so strongly aroused in his behalf that I was quite set up again. Guardian, you don't think it possible that he is justly accused? My dear, I can't think so. This man, whom we have seen so open-hearted and compassionate, who with the might of a giant has the gentleness of a child, who looks as brave a fellow as ever lived, and is so simple and quiet with it, this man justly accused of such a crime. I can't believe it. It's not that I don't or I won't. I can't, and I can't, said Mr. Woodcourt. Still, whatever we believe or know of him, we had better not forget that some appearances are against him. He bore an animosity towards the deceased gentleman. He has openly mentioned it in many places. He is said to have expressed himself violently towards him, and he certainly did. About him, to my knowledge, he admits that he was alone on the scene of the murder within a few minutes of its commission. I sincerely believe him to be as innocent of any participation in it as I am, but these are all reasons for suspicion falling upon him. True, said my guardian, and he added, turning to me, it would be doing him a very bad service, my dear, to shut our eyes to the truth in any of these respects. I felt, of course, that we must admit not only to ourselves, but to others, the full force of the circumstances against him. Yet I knew withal I could not help saying that their weight would not induce us to desert him in his need. Heaven forbid, returned my guardian. We will stand by him as he himself stood by the two poor creatures who are gone. He meant Mr. Gridley and the boy, to both of whom Mr. George had given shelter. Mr. Woodcourt then told us that the trooper's man had been with him before day, after wandering about the streets all night like a distracted creature, that one of the trooper's first anxieties was that we should not suppose him guilty, that he had charged his messenger to represent his perfect innocence with every solemn assurance he could send us. But Mr. Woodcourt had only quieted the man by undertaking to come to our house very early in the morning with these representations. He added that he was now upon his way to see the prisoner himself. My guardian said directly he would go to now. Besides that, I liked the retired soldier very much, and that he liked me. I had that secret interest in what had happened which was only known to my guardian. I felt as if it came close and near to me. It seemed to become personally important to myself that the truth should be discovered, and that no innocent people should be suspected, for suspicion once run wild might run wilder. In a word, I felt as if it were my duty and obligation to go with them. My guardian did not seek to dissuade me, and I went. It was a large prison, with many courts and passages so like one another, and so uniformly paved, that I seemed to gain a new comprehension as I passed along of the fondness that solitary prisoners shut up among the same staring walls from year to year have had, as I have read, for a weed or a stray blade of grass, in an arched room by himself, like a cellar upstairs, with walls so glaringly white that they made the massive iron window bars and iron-bound door even more profoundly black than they were. We found the trooper standing in a corner. He had been sitting on a bench there, and had risen when he heard the locks and bolts turn. When he saw us, he came forward a step with his usual heavy tread, and there stopped and made a slight bow. But as I still advanced, putting out my hand to him, he understood us in a moment. This is a load off my mind, I do assure you, Mr. Gentleman, said he, saluting us with great heartiness and drawing a long breath. And now I don't so much care how it ends. He scarcely seemed to be the prisoner, what with his coolness and his soldierly bearing. He looked far more like the prison guard. This is even a rougher place than my gallery to receive a lady in, said Mr. George, but I know Miss Summerson will make the best of it. As he handed me to the bench on which he had been sitting, I sat down, which seemed to give him great satisfaction. I thank you, miss, said he. Now, George, observed my guardian, as we require no new assurances on your part, so I believe we need give you none on ours. Not at all, sir. I thank you with all my heart. If I was not innocent of this crime, I couldn't look at you and keep my secret to myself under the condescension of the present visit. I feel the present visit very much. I am not one of the eloquent sort, but I feel it, Miss Summerson and gentlemen, deeply. He laid his hand for a moment on his broad chest and bent his head to us. Although he squared himself again directly, he expressed a great amount of natural emotion "By these simple means first," said my guardian, "can we do anything for your personal comfort, George?" "For which, sir," he inquired, clearing his throat, "for your personal comfort is there anything you want that would lessen the hardship of this confinement?" "Well, sir," replied George, after a little cogitation, "I am equally obliged to you. But tobacco being against the rules, I can't say that there is. You will think of many little things perhaps by and by. Whenever you do, George, let us know." "Thank you, sir." "Howsoever," observed Mr. George, with one of his sunburnt smiles, "a man who has been knocking about the world in a vagabond kind of a way as long as I have gets on well enough in a place like the present so far as that goes. Next, as to your case," observed my guardian. "Exactly so, sir," returned Mr. George, folding his arms upon his breast with perfect self-possession and a little curiosity. "How does it stand now?" "Why, sir, it is under remand at present. Bucket gives me to understand that he will probably apply for a series of remands from time to time until the case is more complete. How it is to be made more complete I don't myself see, but I dare say Bucket will manage it somehow." "Why, heavens save us, man," exclaimed my guardian, surprised into his old oddity and vehemence. "You talk of yourself as if you were somebody else." "No offense, sir," said Mr. George, "I am very sensible of your kindness, but I don't see how an innocent man is to make up his mind to this kind of thing without knocking his head against the walls, unless he takes it in that point of view." "That is true enough to a certain extent," returned my guardian, softened. "But my good fellow, even an innocent man must take ordinary precautions to defend himself." "Certainly, sir, and I have done so. I have stated to the magistrates, gentlemen, I am as innocent of this charge as yourselves. What has been stated against me in the way of facts is perfectly true. I know no more about it. I intend to continue stating that, sir. What more can I do? It's the truth." "But the mere truth won't do," rejoined my guardian. "Won't it indeed, sir? Rather a bad lookout for me." Mr. George good-humoredly observed. "You must have a lawyer," pursued my guardian. "We must engage a good one for you." "I ask your pardon, sir," said Mr. George with a step backward. "I am equally obliged, but I must decidedly beg to be excused from anything of that sort." "You won't have a lawyer?" "No, sir." Mr. George shook his head in the most emphatic manner. "I thank you all the same, sir, but no lawyer." "Why not?" "I don't take kindly to the breed," said Mr. George. Gridley didn't, and if you'll excuse my saying so much, I should hardly have thought you did yourself, sir." "That's equity," my guardian explained, a little at a loss. "That's equity, George." "Is it indeed, sir?" returned the trooper in his offhand manner. "I am not acquainted with those shades of names myself, but in a general way I object to the breed." Unfolding his arms and changing his position, he stood with one massive hand upon the table and the other on his hip, as complete a picture of a man who was not to be moved from a fixed purpose as ever I saw. It was in vain that we all three talked to him and endeavored to persuade him. He listened with that gentleness which went so well with his bluff bearing, but was evidently no more shaken by our representations than his place of confinement was. "Pray think once more," Mr. George said. "I have you no wish in reference to your case." "I certainly could wish it to be tried, miss," he returned, "by court-martial, but that is out of the question, as I am well aware. If you will be so good as to favor me with your attention for a couple of minutes, miss, not more, I'll endeavor to explain myself as clearly as I can." He looked at us all three in turn, shook his head a little, as if he were adjusting it in the stock and collar of a tight uniform, and after a moment's reflection went on. "You see, miss, I have been handcuffed and taken into custody and brought here. I am a marked and disgraced man, and here I am. My shooting gallery is rummaged high and low by Bucket. Such property as I have 'tis small is turned this way and that, and it don't know itself. And as aforesaid, here I am. I don't particular complain of that, though I am in these present quarters through no immediately preceding fault of mine. I can very well understand that if I hadn't gone into the vagabond way in my youth, this wouldn't have happened. It has happened. Then comes the question, how to meet it." He rubbed his swarthy forehead for a moment with a good-humored look and said apologetically, "I am such a short-winded talker that I must think a bit." Having thought a bit, he looked up again and resumed, "How to meet it. Now the unfortunate deceased was himself a lawyer, and had a pretty tight hold of me. I don't wish to rake up his ashes, but he had what I should call, if he was living, a devil of a tight hold of me. I don't like his trade the better for that. If I had kept clear of his trade, I should have kept outside this place. But that's not what I mean now. Suppose I had killed him, suppose I really had discharged into his Body any one of those pistols recently fired off that bucket has found at my place, and dear me might have found there any day. Since it has been my place, what should I have done? As soon as I was hard and fast here got a lawyer. He stopped on hearing some one of the locks and bolts, and did not resume until the door had been opened, and was shut again. For what purpose opened, I will mention presently. I should have got a lawyer, and he would have said, as I have often read in the newspapers, my client says nothing, my client reserves his defense, my client this that, and other. Well, 'tis not the custom of that breed to go straight according to my opinion, or to think that other men do say I am innocent, and I get a lawyer, he would be as likely to believe me guilty as not. Perhaps more, what would he do? Whether or not act as if I was shut my mouth up, tell me not to commit myself, keep circumstances back, chop the evidence, small quibble, and get me off paps. But Miss Somerset, do I care for getting off in that way, or would I rather be hanged in my own way? If you'll excuse my mentioning anything so disagreeable to a lady. He had warmed into his subject now, and was under no further necessity to wait a bit. I would rather be hanged in my own way, and I mean to be. I don't intend to say, looking round upon us with his powerful arms akimbo and his dark eyebrows raised, that I am more partial to being hanged than another man. What I say is, I must come off clear and full, or not at all. Therefore, when I hear stated against me what is true, I say it's true, and when they tell me whatever you say will be used, I tell them I don't mind that, I mean it to be used. If they can't make me innocent out of the whole truth, they are not likely to do it out of anything less or anything else. And if they are, it's worth nothing to me taking a pace or two over the stone floor. He came back to the table and finished what he had to say. I thank you, miss and gentlemen, both many times for your attention, and many times more for your interest. That's the plain state of the matter as it points itself out to a mere trooper with a blunt broadsword kind of a mind. I've never done well in life, beyond my duty as a soldier, and if the worst comes, after all, I shall reap pretty much as I have sown. When I got over the first crash of being seized as a murderer, it don't take a rover who is knocked about so much as myself so very long to recover from such a crash. I work my way round to what you find me now. As such I shall remain. No relations will be disgraced by me or made unhappy for me, and that's all I've got to say. The door had been opened to admit another soldier-looking man of less prepossessing appearance at first sight, and a weather-tanned, bright-eyed, wholesome woman with a basket, who from her entrance had been exceedingly attentive to all Mr. George had said. Mr. George had received them with a familiar nod and a friendly look, but without any more particular greeting. In the midst of his address, he now shook them cordially by the hand and said, Miss Summerson and gentlemen, this is an old comrade of mine, Matthew Bagnet, and this is his wife, Mrs. Bagnet. Mr. Magnet made us a stiff military bow, and Mrs. Magnet dropped us a curtsy. Real good friends of mine they are, said Mr. George. It was at their house I was taken with a second hand while in Cella. Mr. Magnet put in, twitching his head angrily, of a good tone for a friend. That money was no object to Matt, said Mr. George. You have heard pretty well all I have been saying to this lady and these two gentlemen. I know it meets your approval. Mr. Magnet, after considering, referred the point to his wife. Old girl, said he, tell him whether or not it meets my approval. Why, George, exclaimed Mrs. Magnet, who had been unpacking her basket, in which there was a piece of cold pickled pork, a little tea and sugar, and a brown loaf. You ought to know it, don't you? Ought to know it's enough to drive a person wild to hear you. You won't be got off this way, and you won't be got off that way. What do you mean by such picking and choosing? It's stuff and nonsense. George, don't be severe upon me and my misfortunes. Mrs. Magnet, said the trooper lightly. Oh, bother your misfortunes, cried Mrs. Magnet, if they don't make you more reasonable than that comes to. I never was so ashamed in my life to hear a man talk folly as I have been to hear you talk this day to the present. Company lawyers, why, what but too many cooks should hinder you from having a dozen lawyers if the gentleman recommended them to you. This is a very sensible woman, said my guardian. I hope you will persuade him. Mrs. Bagnet, persuade him, sir, she returned. Lord bless you, no, you don't know George now. There Mrs. Magnet left her basket to point him out with both her bare brown hands. There he stands, as self-willed and as determined a man in the wrong way as ever put a human creature under heaven. Out of patience, you could as soon take up and shoulder an 8-40-pounder by your own strength as turn that man when he has got a thing into his head and fixed it there. Why, don't I know him, cried Mrs. Magnet. Don't I know you, George? You don't mean to set up for a new character with me after all these years? I hope her friendly indignation had an exemplary effect upon her husband, who shook his head at the trooper several times as a silent recommendation to him to yield between, whilst Mrs. Bagnet looked at me, and I understood from the play of her eyes that she wished me to do something, though I did not comprehend what. "But I have given up talking to you, old fellow, years and years," said Mrs. Bagnet, as she blew a little dust off the pickled pork, looking at me again. "And when ladies and gentlemen know you as well as I do, they'll give up talking to you too, if you are not too headstrong to accept of a bit of dinner here. It is I accept it with many thanks returned." "The trooper do you though, indeed," said Mrs. Magnet, continuing to grumble on good-humoredly. "I'm sure I'm surprised at that. I wonder you don't starve in your own way. Also, it would only be like you. Perhaps you'll set your mind upon that next." Here she again looked at me, and I now perceived from her glances at the door and at me by turns that she wished us to retire and to await her following us outside the prison. Communicating this by similar means to my guardian and Mr. Woodcourt, I rose. "We hope you will think better of it, Mr. George," said I, "and we shall come to see you again, trusting to find you more reasonable, more grateful." "Miss Summerson, you can't find me," he returned, "but more persuasive we can, I hope," said I, "and let me entreat you to consider that the clearing up of this mystery and the discovery of the real perpetrator of this deed may be of the last importance to others besides yourself." He heard me respectfully, but without much heeding these words, which I spoke a little turn from him. Already on my way to the door he was observing this. They afterwards told me my height and figure, which seemed to catch his attention all at once. "'Tis curious," said he, "and yet I thought so at the time." My guardian asked him what he meant. "Why, sir," he answered, "when my ill fortune took me to the dead man's staircase on the night of his murder, I saw a shape so like Miss Summerson's go by me in the dark that I had half a mind to speak to it. For an instant I felt such a shudder as I never felt before or since, and hope I shall never feel again. It came downstairs as I went up," said the trooper, "and crossed the moonlit window with a loose black mantle on. I noticed a deep fringe to it. However, it has nothing to do with the present subject, excepting that Miss Summerson looked so like it at the moment that it came into my head I cannot separate and define the feelings that arose in me after this. It is enough that the vague duty and obligation I had felt upon me from the first of following the investigation was without my distinctly daring to ask myself any question increased, and that I was indignantly sure of there being no possibility of a reason for my being afraid." We three went out of the prison and walked up and down at some short distance from the gate, which was in a retired place. We had not waited long when Mr. and Mrs. Bagnet came out too and quickly joined us. There was a tear in each of Mrs. Bagnet's eyes, and her face was flushed and hurried. "I didn't let George see what I thought about it, you know, miss," was her first remark when she came up. "But he's in a bad way, poor old fellow, not with care and prudence and good help," said my guardian. "A gentleman like you ought to know best, sir," returned Mrs. Bagnet, hurriedly drying her eyes on the hem of her gray cloak. "But I am uneasy for him. He's been so careless and said so much that he never meant that gentlemen of the juries might not understand him as Lignanum may do, and then such a number of circumstances have happened bad for him, and such a number of people will be brought forward to speak against him, and Bucket is so deep with a second hand while in cellar, and said he played the fife when a boy." Mr. Magnet added with great solemnity, "Now, I tell you, miss," said Mrs. Magnet, "and when I say miss I mean all just come into the corner of the wall, and I'll tell you." Mrs. Magnus hurried us into a more secluded place, and was at first too breathless to proceed, occasioning Mr. Magnus to say, "Oh, go tell him why." Then miss the old girl proceeded, untying the strings of her bonnet for more air. "You could as soon moved over a castle as moved George on this point, unless you had got a new power to move him with. And I have got it. You are a jewel of a woman," said my guardian. "Go on now, I tell you, miss," she proceeded, clapping her hands in her hurry and agitation a dozen times in every sentence, "that what he says concerning no relations is all bosh. They don't know of him, but he does know of them. He has said more to me at odd times than to anyone else, and it weren't for nothing that he once spoke to my Woolwich about whitening and wrinkling mothers' heads for £50. He had seen his mother that day. She is alive and must be brought here straight instantly." Mrs. Bagnet put some pins into her mouth and began pinning up her skirts all round a little higher than the level of her gray cloak, which she accomplished with surpassing Dispatch and dexterity Lingnam said, Mrs. Magnet, you take care of the children, old man, and give me the umbrella. I'm away to Lincolnshire to bring that old lady here. But bless the woman, cried my guardian, with his hand in his pocket. How is she going? What money has she got? Mrs. Bagnet made another application to her skirts and brought forth a leathern purse in which she hastily counted over a few shillings, and which she then shut up with perfect satisfaction. Never you mind for me, miss. I'm a soldier's wife and accustomed to travel my own way. Ligname, old boy, kissing him. 1 for yourself, 3 for the children. Now I'm away into Lincolnshire after George's mother. And she actually set off, while we 3 stood looking at one another lost in amazement. She actually trudged away in her grey cloak at a sturdy pace and turned the corner and was gone. Mr. Magnet said, my guardian, do you mean to let her go in that way? Can't help it, he returned, made a way home, once from another quarter of the world with the same grey cloak and same umbrella. Whatever the old girl says, do it. Whenever the old girl says I'll do it, she does it. Then she is as honest and genuine as she looks, rejoined my guardian, and it is impossible to say more for her. She's Color Sergeant of the Nonpareil Battalion, said Mr. Magnet, looking at us over his shoulder as he went his way also. And there's not such another, but I never owned to it before. Her discipline must be maintained. Chapter 53. The Track. Mr. Bucket and his fat forefinger are much in consultation together under existing circumstances. When Mr. Bucket has a matter of this pressing interest under his consideration, the fat forefinger seems to rise to the dignity of a familiar demon. He puts it to his ears, and it whispers information. He puts it to his lips, and it enjoins him to secrecy. He rubs it over his nose, and it sharpens his scent. He shakes it before a guilty man, and it charms him to his destruction. The ogres of the Detective Temple invariably predict that when Mr. Bucket and that finger are in much conference, a terrible avenger will be heard of before long. Otherwise mildly studious in his observation of human nature, on the whole a benignant philosopher, not disposed to be severe upon the follies of mankind, Mr. Bucket pervades a vast number of houses and strolls about an infinity of streets. To outward appearance rather languishing for want of an object, he is in the friendliest condition towards his species, and will drink with most of them. He is free with his money, affable in his manners, innocent in his conversation. But through the placid stream of his life there glides an undercurrent of forefinger. Time and place cannot bind Mr. Bucket. Like man in the abstract, he is here today and gone tomorrow. But very unlike man indeed, he is here again the next day. This evening he will be casually looking into the iron extinguishers at the door of Celeste Dedlock's house in town. And tomorrow morning he will be walking on the leads at Chesney Wold, where erst the old man walked, whose ghost is propitiated with 100 guineas, drawers, desks, pockets, all things belonging to him. Mr. Bucket examines a few hours afterwards. He and the Romang will be alone together, comparing forefingers. It is likely that these occupations are irreconcilable with home enjoyment, but it is certain that Mr. Bucket at present does not go home, though in general he highly appreciates the society of Mrs. Bucket, a lady of a natural detective genius, which if it had been improved by professional exercise might have done great things, but which has paused at the level of a clever amateur. He holds himself aloof from that dear solitude. Mrs. Bucket is dependent on their lodger, fortunately, an amiable lady in whom she takes an interest for companionship and conversation. A great crowd assembles in Lincoln's Inn Fields on the day of the funeral. Celeste Dedlock attends the ceremony in person. Strictly speaking, there are only 3 other human followers, that is to say Lord Doodle William Buffy and the debilitated cousin thrown in as a makeweight, but the amount of inconsolable carriages is immense. The peerage contributes more for wheeled affliction than has ever been seen in that neighborhood, such as the assemblage of armorial bearings on coach panels, that the Herald's College might be supposed to have lost its father and mother at a blow. The Duke of Fudge sends a splendid pile of dust and ashes, with silver wheel boxes, patent axles, all the last improvements, and 3 bereaved Vorms 6 feet high holding on behind, and a bunch of woe. All the state coachmen in London seem plunged into mourning, and if that dead old man of the rusty garb be not beyond a taste in horse flesh, which appears impossible, it must be highly gratified this day. Quiet among the undertakers and the aqueducts, and the carves of so many legs, all steeped in grief. Mr. Bucket sits concealed in one of the inconsolable carriages, and at his ease surveys the crowd through the lattice blinds. He has a keen eye for a crowd as for what not, and looking here, and there, now from this side of the carriage, now from the other, now up at the house windows, now along the people's heads, nothing escapes him. And there you are, my partner, says Mr. Bucket to himself, apostrophizing Mrs. Bucket stationed by his favor on the steps of the deceased house. And so you are, and so you are, and very well indeed. You are looking, Mrs. Bucky. The procession has not started yet, but is waiting for the cause of its assemblage to be brought out. Mr. Bucket, in the foremost emblazoned carriage, uses his two fat forefingers to hold the lattice a hair's breadth open, while he looks, and it says a great deal for his attachment as a husband that he is still occupied with Mrs. B. There you are, my partner, he murmuringly repeats, and I'll lodge with you. I'm taking notice of you. Mrs. Bucket, I hope you're all right in your health, my dear. Not another word does Mr. Bucket say, but sits with most attentive eyes until the sacked depository of noble secrets is brought down. Where are all those secrets now? Does he keep them? Yet did they fly with him on that sudden journey, and until the procession moves and Mr. Bucket's view is changed, after which he composes himself for an easy ride and takes note of the fittings of the carriage in case he should ever find such. Knowledge useful. Contrast enough between Mr. Tulkinghorn shut up in his dark carriage and Mr. Bucket shut up in his between the immeasurable track of space beyond the little wound that has thrown the one into the fixed sleep which jolts so heavily over the stones of the street, and the narrow track of blood which keeps the other in the watchful state expressed in every hair of his head. But it is all one to both. Neither is troubled about that. Mr. Bucket sets out the procession in his own easy manner and glides from the carriage. When the opportunity he has settled with himself arrives, he makes for Celeste Deadlocks, which is at present a sort of home to him, where he comes and goes as he likes at all hours, where he is always welcome and made much of, where he knows the whole establishment and walks in an atmosphere of mysterious greatness. No knocking or ringing for Mr. Bucket. He has caused himself to be provided with a key and can pass in at his pleasure as he is crossing the hall. Mercury informs him, here's another letter for you, Mr. Bucket, come by post, and gives it him another one. He says, Mr. Bucket, if Mercury should chance to be possessed by any lingering curiosity as to Mr. Bucket's letters, that weary person is not the man to gratify it. Mr. Bucket looks at him as if his face were a visitor of some miles in length, and he were leisurely contemplating the same. Do you happen to carry a box? Says Mr. Bucket. Unfortunately, Mercury is no snuff taker. Could you fetch me a pinch from anywhere? Says Mr. Bucket. Thank you, it don't matter what it is, I'm not particular as to the kind, thank you. Having leisurely helped himself from a canister borrowed from somebody downstairs for the purpose, and having made a considerable show of tasting it first with one side of his nose and then with the other, Mr. Bucket, with much deliberation, pronounces it of the right sort and goes on, letter in hand. Now, although Mr. Bucket walks upstairs to the little library within the larger one, with the face of a man who receives some scores of letters every day, it happens that much correspondence is not incidental to his life. He is no great scribe, rather handling his pen like the pocket staff he carries about with him, always convenient to his grasp, and discourages correspondence with himself and others as being too artless and direct a way of doing delicate business. Further, he often sees damaging letters produced in evidence, and has occasion to reflect that it was a green thing to write them. For these reasons, he has very little to do with letters either as sender or receiver, and yet he has received around half dozen within the last 24 hours. And this, says Mr. Bucket, spreading it out on the table, is in the same hand and consists of the same two words. What two words? He turns the key in the door, ungirdles his black pocket-book of fate. To many lays another letter by it, and reads boldly written in each, Lady Dedlock. Yes, yes, says Mr. Bucket, but I could have made the money without this anonymous information. Having put the letters in his book of fate and girdled it up again, he unlocks the door just in time to admit his dinner, which is brought upon a goodly tray with a decanter of sherry. Mr. Bucket frequently observes in friendly circles where there is no restraint, but he likes a toothful of your fine old brown East India sherry better than anything you can offer him. Consequently, he fills and empties his glass with a smack of his lips, and is proceeding with his refreshment when an idea enters his mind. Mr. Bucket softly opens the door of communication between that room and the next and looks in the library is deserted, and the fire is sinking low. Mr. Bucket's eye, after taking a pigeon flight round the room, alights upon a table where letters are usually put. As they arrive, several letters for Celeste are upon it. Mr. Bucket draws near and examines the directions. No, he says, there's none in that hand. It's only me, as is written to. I can break it to Sir Leicester Baronet tomorrow. With that he returns to finish his dinner with a good appetite, and after a light nap is summoned into the drawing room. Celeste has received him there these several evenings past to know whether he has anything to report. The debilitated cousin, much exhausted by the funeral, and Volumnia are in attendance. Mr. Bucket makes 3 distinctly different bows to these 3 people: a bow of homage to Celeste, a bow of gallantry to Volumnia, and a bow of recognition to the debilitated cousin, to whom it airily says, "You are a swell about town, and you know me, and I know you," having distributed these little specimens of his tact. Mr. Bucket rubs his hands. "Have you anything new to communicate, officer?" inquired Sir Leicester. "Do you wish to hold any conversation with me in private?" "Why not tonight, Sir Leicester Baronet?" "Because my time pursues, Sir Leicester, is wholly at your disposal with a view to the vindication of the outraged majesty of the law." Mr. Bucket coughs and glances at Volumnia, rouged and necklace, as though he would respectfully observe, "I do assure you, you're a pretty creature. I've seen hundreds worse looking at your time of life." "I have indeed." The fair Volumnia, not quite unconscious, perhaps, of the humanizing influence of her charms, pauses in the writing of cocked hat notes and meditatively adjusts the pearl necklace. Mr. Bucket prices that decoration in his mind and thinks it as likely as not that Volumnia is writing poetry. "If I have not pursued Celeste in the most emphatic manner, adjured you, officer, to exercise your utmost skill in this atrocious case, I particularly desire to take the present opportunity of rectifying any omission I may have made. Let no expense be a consideration. I am prepared to defray all charges. You can incur none in pursuit of the object you have undertaken. That I shall hesitate for a moment to bear." Mr. Bucket made Celeste's bow again. "As a response to this liberality, my mind," Celeste adds with a generous warmth, "has not, as may be easily supposed, recovered its tone. Since the late diabolical occurrence, it is not likely ever to recover its tone, but it is full of indignation. Tonight, after undergoing the ordeal of consigning to the tomb the remains of a faithful, a zealous, a devoted adherent." Sir Leicester's voice trembles, and his gray hair stirs upon his head. Tears are in his eyes, the best part of his nature. He is aroused. "I declare," he says, "I solemnly declare that until this crime is discovered, and in the course of justice punished, I almost feel as if there were a stain upon my name. A gentleman who has devoted a large portion of his life to me, a gentleman who has devoted the last day of his life to me, a gentleman who has constantly sat at my table and slept under my roof, goes from my house to his own, and is struck down within an hour of his leaving my house. I cannot say but that he may have been followed from my house, watched at my house, even first marked because of his association with my house, which may have suggested his possessing greater wealth and being altogether of greater importance than his own retiring demeanor would have indicated. If I cannot, with my means and influence and my position, bring all the perpetrators of such a crime to light, I fail in the assertion of my respect for that gentleman's memory and of my fidelity towards one who was ever faithful to me." While he makes this protestation with great emotion and earnestness, looking round the room as if he were addressing an assembly, Mr. Bucket glances at him with an observant gravity in which there might be, but for the audacity of the thought, a touch of compassion. "The ceremony of today," continues Sir Leicester, strikingly illustrative of the respect in which my deceased friend, he lays a stress upon the word for death, levels all distinctions, was held by the flower of the land, has, I say, aggravated the shock I have received from this most horrible and audacious crime. If it were my brother who had committed it, I would not spare him." Mr. Bucket looks very grave. Volumnia remarks of the deceased that he was the most trustworthy and dearest person. "You must feel it as a deprivation to you," Miss replies Mr. Bucket soothingly. "No doubt he was calculated to be a deprivation. I'm sure he was." Volumnia gives Mr. Bucket to understand in reply that her sensitive mind is fully made up never to get the better of it as long as she lives, that her nerves are unstrung forever, and that she has not the least expectation of ever smiling again. Meanwhile she folds up a cocked hat for that redoubtable old general at Bath, descriptive of her melancholy condition. It gives a start to a delicate female, says Mr. Bucket sympathetically, but it'll wear off. Belania wishes of all things to know what is doing, whether they are going to convict or whatever it is that dreadful soldier, whether he had any accomplices or whatever the thing is called in the law, and a great deal more to the like artless purpose. Why, you see, Miss, returns Mr. Bucket, bringing the finger into persuasive action, and such is his natural gallantry that he had almost said, my dear, it ain't easy to answer those questions at the present moment. Not at the present moment. I've kept myself on this case, Sir Leicester Baronet, whom Mr. Bucket takes into the conversation in right of his importance morning, noon, and night. But for a glass or two of sherry, I don't think I could have had my mind so much upon the stretch as it has been. I could answer your questions, miss, but duty forbids it. Sir Leicester Dedlock Baronet will very soon be made acquainted with all that has been traced, and I hope that he may find it. Mr. Bucket again looks grave to his satisfaction. The debilitated cousin only hopes some fellow be executed. Example thinks more interests wanted get man hanged present time than get man plays 10,000 a year. Hasn't a doubt. Example far better hang wrong fellow than no fellow. You know life, you know, sir, says Mr. Bucket with a complimentary twinkle of his eye and crook of his finger. And you can confirm what I've mentioned to this lady. You don't want to be told that from information I have received. I've gone to work. You're up to what a lady can't be expected to be up to, Lord, especially in your elevated station of society, miss, says Mr. Bucket, quite reddening at another narrow escape from my dear. The officer of Almonia observes, Sir Leicester is faithful to his duty, and perfectly right. Mr. Bucket murmurs, glad to have the honor of your approbation, Sir Leicester Baronet. In fact, Volumia proceeds, Sir Leicester, it is not holding up a good model for imitation to ask the officer any such questions as you have put to him. He is the best judge of his own responsibility. He acts upon his responsibility, and it does not become us who assist in making the laws to impede or interfere with those who carry them into execution. Or, says Sir Leicester somewhat sternly, for Volania was going to cut in before he had rounded his sentence, or who vindicate their outraged majesty. Volumia, with all humility, explains that she had not merely the plea of curiosity to urge in common with the giddy youth of her sex in general, but that she is perfectly dying with regret and interest for the darling man whose loss they all deplore. Very well, Bulimnia, returns Sir Esther, then you cannot be too discreet. Mr. Bucket takes the opportunity of a pause to be heard again. Sir Leicester Baronet, I have no objections to telling this lady, with your leave, and among ourselves, that I look upon the case as pretty well completed. Is a beautiful case, and what little is wanting to complete it I expect to be able to supply in a few hours. I am very glad indeed to hear it, says Sir Leicester. Highly creditable to you, Sir Leicester Dedlock Baronet, returns Mr. Bucket very seriously. I hope it may at one and the same time do me credit and prove satisfactory to all when I depict it as a beautiful case. You see, miss, Mr. Bucket goes on, glancing gravely at Celeste, I mean from my point of view, as considered from other points of view, such cases will always involve more or less unpleasantness. Very strange things comes to our knowledge in families, Miss, bless your heart, what you would think to be phenomena. Quite. Volumnia, with her innocent little scream, supposes so, oi, and even in Gentile families and high families and great families, says Mr. Bucket, again gravely eyeing Celeste aside. I have had the honor of being employed in high families before, and you have no idea. Come, I'll go so far as to say not even you have any idea, sir, this to the debilitated cousin, what games goes on the cousin who has been casting sofa pillows on his head in a prostration of boredom. Yawns. Well, I being the used up for very likely. Celeste, deeming it time to dismiss the officer here, majestically interposes with the words, very good, thank you, and also with a wave of his hand implying not only that there is an end of the discourse, but that if high families fall into low habits, they must take the consequences. You will not forget, officer, he adds with condescension, that I am at your disposal when you please. Mr. Bucket, still grave, inquires if tomorrow morning now would suit, in case he should be as forward as he expects to be. Celeste replies, all times are alike to me. Mr. Bucket makes his 3 bows and is withdrawing when a forgotten point occurs to him. Might I ask, by the by, he says in a low voice, cautiously returning, who posted the reward bill on the staircase? I ordered it to be put up there, replies Celeste. Would it be considered a liberty, Sir Leicester Dedlock Baronet, if I was to ask you why? Not at all. I chose it as a Conspicuous part of the house, I think it cannot be too prominently kept before the whole establishment. I wish my people to be impressed with the enormity of the crime, the determination to punish it, and the hopelessness of escape at the same time. Officer, if you in your better knowledge of the subject see any objection, Mr. Bucket sees none now. The bill having been put up had better not be taken down. Repeating his 3 bows, he withdraws, closing the door on Volumia's little scream, which is a preliminary to her remarking that that charmingly horrible person is a perfect blue chamber in his fondness for society and his adaptability to all grades. Mr. Bucket is presently standing before the whole fire, bright and warm on the early winter night, admiring Mercury. Why, you're 6'2", I suppose, says Mr. Bucket. Bree says, Mercury, are you so much? But then you see you're broad in proportion, and don't look at you not one of the weak-legged ones. You ain't. Was you ever modeled now? Mr. Bucket asks, conveying the expression of an artist into the turn of his eye and head. Mercury never was modeled. Then you ought to be, you know, says Mr. Bucket, and a friend of mine that you'll hear of one day as a Royal Academy sculptor would stand something handsome to make a drawing of your proportions for the marble. My lady's out, ain't she? Out to dinner. Goes out pretty well every day, don't she? Yes, not to be wondered at, says Mr. Bucket. Such a fine woman as her. So handsome and so graceful and so elegant as like a fresh lemon on a dinner table, ornamental. Wherever she goes. Was your father in the same way of life as yourself? Answer, in the negative. Mine was, says Mr. Bucket. My father was first a page, then a footman, then a butler, then a steward, then an innkeeper. Lived universally respected and died lamented. Said with his last breath that he considered service the most honorable part of his career. And so it was. I've a brother in service and a brother-in-law. My lady, a good temper. Mercury replies, as good as you can expect. Says Mr. Bucket, a little spoiled, a little capricious. Lord, what can you anticipate when they are so handsome as that? And we like 'em all the better for it, don't we? Mercury, with his hands in the pockets of his bright peach blossom small clothes, stretches his symmetrical silk legs with the air of a man of gallantry, and can't deny it. Come the roll of wheels and a violent ringing at the bell. Talk of the angels, says Mr. Bucket. Here she is. The doors are thrown open, and she passes through the hall, still very pale. She is dressed in slight mourning and wears 2 beautiful bracelets. Either their beauty or the beauty of her arms is particularly attractive to Mr. Bucket. He looks at them with an eager eye and rattles something in his pocket. Apes, perhaps noticing him at his distance, she turns an inquiring look on the other. Mercury, who has brought her home. Mr. Bucket, my lady. Mr. Bucket makes a leg and comes forward, passing his familiar demon over the region of his mouth. Are you waiting to see Sir Lester? No, my lady, I've seen him. Have you anything to say to me? Not just at present, my lady. Have you made any new discoveries? A few, my lady. This is merely in passing. She scarcely makes a stop and sweeps upstairs alone. Mr. Bucket, moving towards the staircase foot, watches her as she goes up the steps. The old man came down to his grave, past murderous groups of statuary repeated with their shadowy weapons on the wall, past the printed bill, which he looks at going by out of view. She's a lovely woman too, she really is, says Mr. Bucket, coming back to Mercury. Don't look quite healthy though. Is not quite healthy. Mercury informs him suffers much from headaches. Really? That's a pity. Walking. Mr. Bucket would recommend for that. Well, she tries walking. Mercury rejoins, walk sometimes for 2 hours when she has them bad by night. Are you sure you're quite so much as 6'3", asks Mr. Bucket, begging your pardon for interrupting you a moment. Not a doubt about it. You're so well put together that I shouldn't have thought it. But the household troops, though considered fine men, are built so straggling. Walks by night. Does she when it's moonlight though? Oh yes, when it's moonlight, of course. Oh, of course. Conversational and acquiescent on both sides. I suppose you ain't in the habit of walking yourself, says Mr. Bucket. Not much time for it, I should say. Besides which, Mercury don't like it, prefers carriage exercise. To be sure, says Mr. Bucket, that makes a difference now I think of it, says Mr. Bucket, warming his hands and looking pleasantly at the blaze. She went out walking the very night of this business. To be sure she did. I let her into the garden over the way and left her there. Certainly you did. I saw you doing it. I didn't see you, says Mercury. I was rather in a hurry, returns Mr. Bucket, for I was going to visit a aunt of mine that lives at Chelsea next door, but to the old original Bun House, 90-year-old. The old lady is a single woman and got a little property. Yes, I chanced to be passing at the time. Let's see, what time might it be? It wasn't 10:30. You're right, so it was. And if I don't deceive myself, my lady was muffled in a loose black mantle with a deep fringe to it. Of course she was. Mr. Bucket must return to a little work he has to get on with upstairs. But he must shake hands with Mercury in acknowledgement of his agreeable conversation. And will he? This is all he asks. Will he, when he has a leisure half-hour, think of bestowing it on that Royal Academy sculptor for the advantage of both parties? Chapter 54. Springing a mind refreshed by sleep, Mr. Bucket rises betimes in the morning and prepares for a field day, smartened up by the aid of a clean shirt and a wet hairbrush, with which instrument on occasions of ceremony he lubricates such thin locks as remain to him after his life of severe study. Mr. Bucket lays in a breakfast of 2 mutton chops as a foundation to work upon, together with tea, eggs, toast, and marmalade on a corresponding scale. Having much enjoyed these strengthening matters, and having held subtle conference with his familiar demon, he confidently instructs Mercury just to mention quietly to Celeste Dedlock Baronet that whenever he's ready for me, I'm ready for him. A gracious message being returned that Celeste will expedite his dressing and join Mr. Bucket in the library. Within 10 minutes, Mr. Bucket repairs to that apartment and stands before the fire with his finger on his chin, looking at the blazing coals. Thoughtful Mr. Bucket is as a man may be, with weighty work to do, but composed, sure, confident from the expression of his face. He might be a famous whist player for a large stake, say 100 guineas certain, with a game in his hand, but with a high reputation involved in his playing his hand out to the last card in a masterly way. Not in the least anxious or disturbed is Mr. Bucket when Celeste appears, but he eyes the baronet aside as he comes slowly to his easy chair with that observant gravity of yesterday, in which there might have been yesterday, but for the audacity of the idea, a touch of compassion. I'm sorry to have kept you waiting, officer, but I am rather later than my usual hour this morning. I am not well. The agitation and the indignation from which I have recently suffered have been too much for me. I am subject to doubt, Celeste was going to say in disposition, and would have said it to anybody else, but Mr. Bucket palpably knows all about it, and recent circumstances have brought it on. As he takes his seat with some difficulty and with an air of pain, Mr. Bucket draws a little nearer, standing with one of his large hands on the library table. I am not aware, officer, Celeste observes, raising his eyes to his face, whether you wish us to be alone, but that is entirely as you please. If you do, well and good. If not, Miss Dedlock would be interested.